That sounds good. Anyway, thank you for all of you who came this afternoon. They had a wonderful medical program this morning, and I know some of you were here for that. This afternoon we're going to talk about educational issues related to Tourette syndrome, which is, I know, a big topic for lots of parents, lots of educators, lots of people just in general. My name is Sue Connors, and I am the president of the Tourette Association of Greater New York State, which services this Albany area and many other areas. we have a big territory that we cover. And I always tell people, because I know we have some teachers in the audience today, I always tell people my most important job in life was to be a teacher. I was a middle school teacher for 33 years in a school outside of Buffalo, and that's probably what most qualifies me and to do what I'm doing. And the second thing that qualifies me, probably even more so, is that I have Tourette myself. And that, I always tell people when I present, it's kind of like show and tell. You can learn all about Tourette by just watching me, and then it'll be all over. It's not a whole lot more you have to say. Anyway, it's a pretty small group this afternoon, so if anybody, has questions along the way, I really don't mind being interrupted in case you might forget what you were going to ask. Just raise your hand. I always tell people I was a middle school teacher for 33 years, and I'm used to being interrupted. So, if you raise your hand, that's an extra plus, because they don't always do that in 7th and 8th grade, so I don't mind at all. The other thing I want to tell you is that I know you probably want to take notes. I am going to provide my PowerPoint to everyone. You all gave me your emails addresses, so I will email that to everybody probably before I leave Albany tomorrow. I'll have that done. And I also have some electronic handouts that, rather than waste some trees, I just put them electronically when I present, so you'll be getting some, and I'll talk about some of the handouts as I'm going along, so you have some idea of what things you can look for and what things you can't. And for those of you who are parents and maybe not know, we have a program tomorrow at the YMCA in Del Mar, and it's a program for the kids to get together with the YMCA staff and do all kinds of neat activities, and the parents, we're doing a seminar, and it's mostly about educational rights. What does your child qualify for as a child with Tourette, with a disability, and just how do you go about getting the appropriate services and the appropriate placement and everything for your child in a school setting. So there's a lot going on this weekend. We're trying to cover all angles. But anyway, as an educator, I always like to start my presentation with this quote, and if you've seen it before, kind of bear with me as I read it. I've come to the conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. It is my personal approach that creates the climate. It is my daily mood that makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or honor, hurt or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, and probably most importantly, a child humanized or dehumanized. And it's a quote by an ancient philosopher, Haim Gnat, and honestly, I had this hanging in my classroom for 31 of the 33 years I taught. My second year I found it, and I loved it. And I think, one of the points of my presentation is, to teach kids, first of all, get teachers to understand how important they are in that classroom and setting the tone. So many times I go into schools, and it's the tone of that classroom that really sets the climate for the kid's success or failure. And it really sometimes it's hard to see, but it's so important to have that. And I think if you are an educator, you know that, if you're in a bad mood, the kids are going to be in a bad mood. You kind of put that across to them. And I also think that one of the points of my whole presentation is to teach you all the great things that we know about Tourette. We're a lot further ahead than we were when I started my chapter many years ago. However, my main goal is to get you to see these kids as kids and not as their symptoms. To understand, what their life is like from day to day. And it's not always an easy existence for them. We're going to have a panel of some of the kids that were here this morning, and they're going to come back this afternoon, and they're going to talk about different things that they've had happen to them in the school setting, and things that have worked and things that haven't worked. And we heard some of them this morning, and some of them are heart-wrenching to hear what some of these kids have been through to get where they are today. So we got lots going on, but I always like to start with that because I think it's, I want you to be able to look at these kids as just, these are kids, they're not their symptoms. And so many times we see the symptoms of a disability before we actually look inside and see that child. And I've worked with some incredible kids over the years with Tourette for the 30-some years I've done this chapter. And, it's sad sometimes that they can't see that. I had a teacher just recently say to me that this boy, like a lot of our kids, has handwriting issues. And, very difficult down to the point of actually being diagnosed with dysgraphia. And she said, well, depending on his mood, he can write. I know. I mean, that is going to make or break that child. And I hated to say it, but I looked at her and said, I don't want to be rude, but that kind of offends me. Because I'm in a great mood, but if you asked me to write a sentence right now, you wouldn't be able to read it. It has nothing to do whether I'm in a good mood or bad mood or feel like it or don't feel like it. That's just what it is. So we're going to talk a lot about those things, but I always like to start out also, this is one of my favorites, and as an educator, you'll get it. Here's this poor teacher at the end of the day, you see she's exasperated, and it says, if I had but one life to give for my country, it would be Billy in the third row. We've all had those students, and one of the reasons I put that there is because I honestly think that Tourette syndrome is one of the most challenging disorders that you will work with in a classroom setting, and there are two really very good reasons for that. The first reason is that it changes all the time. You just think you've got a handle on things. Okay, these are the tics, these are the obsessions, and then somebody walks in the next day and is yelling out something else. And it's like, okay, wait, what happened? Why are we doing this? And especially with children, tics change constantly. And so you never know from day to day. And one of my favorite things to tell teachers when they complain about a particular tic is, be careful what you wish for. Because, I had a teacher one time from a district outside of Buffalo where I live, and she said that she was really being driven kind of crazy, and even though she understood it, by a student in her class that had a hooting tic, like an owl. He just hooted and hooted. And I said that exact thing to her, be careful what you wish for. About 3.5 weeks later, she called and she goes, yeah, I think I want the hooting back. Now he's yelling shit across my classroom. So you just don't know. And that's one of the most challenging parts of it. But I also feel like I have to give parents their due. Can my mother please borrow a cup of Prozac? And I think as parents, we've all had those days when it's exhausting. It's exhausting dealing with all of the things that go along with Tourette, but also dealing with the schools and trying to get the appropriate services and get everybody educated. And I think the second thing that makes Tourette syndrome extremely difficult, and not really difficult but challenging, is that for quite a few years now, we are calling it a spectrum disorder, the Tourette spectrum disorder. And I kind of have known that for many, many years of my life, but finally, the National Association is starting to use that term. And what that really means is that, I rarely see Tourette by itself. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's pretty rare. And we're going to talk a lot about some of the comorbidities, some of the comorbid or associated disorders, because at any given moment in the child's life, those could be more problematic than the tics themselves. And so I think that's what's challenging. I'll go in and they'll say, well, that has nothing to do with Tourette. That's nothing to do with the tic. But, it could be a million other things that tend to go along with Tourette. And so I think it's just a complex disorder with lots of challenges that change all the time. And it's just a lot of different things. So having said that, we'll get into the program. Just some basic facts about Tourette. Even though it doesn't always appear neurological, it is neurological or neurobiological. We know that. It often appears, and especially in school settings, as more emotional, behavioral, psychiatric. I get all the lingo as I go into schools, probably 6 and 7 a week. And I always like to give one illustration and a particular tic that I deal with. And I'll have to warn the two people who are going to ride home with me to Buffalo tomorrow, because Mickey and Medora, you don't know my driving tics yet, so I'll teach you all about them. because I have a whole repertoire of driving tics. One of them is I constantly hit my little finger on things. I mean, that's something I do when I sit here at the table, when I'm in my living room chair, I hit it on the arm of the chair, but when I'm driving, I hit it on the windshield of my car. And I do it really hard. I mean, I've broken that finger about 4 times. That's how hard I do it. However, because this is Tourette, it doesn't always look like what it is. People driving by me think I'm doing this. So, I expected on the journey here, I drove by myself from Buffalo, that I would have quite a few people go by me and give me the finger back, but it was really more than usual. It must have been a rough day across the state because, a lot of people were giving me this lovely symbol. And I've long decided, what can I do? I can't be throwing Tourette pamphlets out the window while I'm driving. Nobody wants that. So I just kind of wave and smile and hope they don't come after me. It's that kind of thing. It doesn't always look like what it is. For most people, it is a lifelong disorder. It often gets better in adulthood, but I've rarely seen a person where it completely goes away. I had a man recently, actually he's a relative of mine, and in my family, everybody has Tourette. He said to me, I'm so glad I outgrew this when I was 18. I go, yeah, I'm so glad you did. But his tics as a child were so much worse, and now he's got some facial grimaces and things, so it's not gone. It's just, most people do get better, not everybody. Unfortunately, my tics did not get better when I got older. They stayed the same, and in a lot of instances got worse. There's definitely a genetic component to it. The people we were this morning heard, lots of talk about that. In my family, it's very easy to find, and it's very, very much genetic. And I was the first one to be diagnosed. I started with my symptoms when I was about 6.5, and I got my diagnosis when I was 36.5. So 30 short years later, somebody finally figured out what was going on. And by that time, I have 5 siblings, and every one of them, after I was diagnosed, were diagnosed. We all have it. My mother had it, and she never knew until she was in her mid to late 60s. My dad died in the 70s, and we had no idea, but we have since found out that it's on his side of the family also. So, there's very little chance that we were not going to get it. And the last time we sat down, we've actually been studied, our family has been studied by the University of Rochester in genetic studies because there's such a large number of us. The last we counted, and I'm just talking about immediate family, like brothers and sisters, great nieces and nephews, great nieces and nephews. We have now, as of this summer, got 29 people in my family with Tourette syndrome. So all I can say is you can imagine what Thanksgiving dinner is like. And I'll just leave it at that, okay? So, there is that genetic component to it. And so it's very often, we do a camp every year in our chapter. And one of the interesting things about our camp is that we often get several children from one family. It's not unusual at all. And Ezra and Willow are a perfect example of that. And it's not unusual because it does tend to run in families. We know that except for the genetic component, we don't really know the exact cause of Tourette. We know that males are affected 3 to 4 times more than females. But if you think of other neurological disorders, especially if you're in the field of education, how many more boys get ADHD? How many more boys get learning disabilities? How many more boys get autism? All of those are much more prevalent. And it's the same thing with Tourette. And we are so excited when on any given year we can have 3 girls' cabins at camp. It's very exciting because usually it's like 6 to 2, 7 to 2, and this year we actually had 3, so that was very good for us. There is, at this point, no diagnostic medical test for it, which makes it difficult. If you see some of the wonderful doctors you heard from this morning, and you are lucky to find that, they're going to pick up on it. But so many times, you start out with a pediatrician or, a family doctor, and if they do medical tests, and I started with medical tests when I was 6 years old. I started with my first medical test, I was doing eye blinking, that was my first tic, and that got me to the eye doctor. And I grew up in a very, very, very small town in the Adirondack Mountains, and there was only one eye doctor in town. And I think he was 95 and blind himself, but anyway. I left his office with bifocals at 6.5, yes, and now I couldn't walk because I was tripping over my own feet with these crazy bifocals. The next tic I had was constant sniffing, and of course that got me to the allergist. And this is pretty much how life went because nobody really could figure out what was going on. And they did CAT scans and EEGs and anything that was available back then, because I'm not young anymore. I've had, since that time, I've had, SPECT scans and PET scans and MRIs. And, the research is getting better, we're getting better, but we still don't have that genetic or that medical tool yet. So it's diagnosed through criteria, and I'm going to go through those with you. I think it's important for educators and parents to know what you're looking for, first of all, what could be a tic and what could not be a tic. But I also think it's important not just for the child you're working with, but also for other kids. I have to say, when we first started our chapter back in the mid-'80s, all of my office phone calls came from parents. I mean, I rarely got a call from a school. And now I have to say 85 to 90% are coming from schools. So that's really good news because, educators are learning about it. They're figuring it out. They see someone in their class. It looks like maybe that's what it is. How do we deal with it? Where do we go? And, we kind of guide you on your path. So that's very good news. The carrier gene has not yet been identified. It's probably several genes that cause it. And I remember probably about 6 years ago, maybe longer than that now, there was a big news article about how they discovered one of the Tourette genes, and everybody was all excited and thought, we've got it, we're off and running. But it's nothing when you think of how many genes that probably cause it. So there's a lot more research to be done with that. And the other thing that's been a stickler for me for many, many years is the prevalence of this disorder. I mean, I think until recently, when the Centers for Disease Control did a big study, I think that the statistics were still 200,000 in the United States. And there are almost that many in my family, so I knew that wasn't accurate. So, but now they have indicated, the recent studies have shown that 1 in 100 kids have either full-blown Tourette syndrome or a tic disorder. It's that common. And, I go into schools and I jokingly say to them, how many kids are in the building? And they'll say, 550. And I said, so you got one child diagnosed with Tourette? Start looking. There are definitely more kids here, given the prevalence of it. But a lot of times if the symptoms are mild, they don't pick up on it, or even probably worse, is they look at it more as a behavioral issue. And they're punishing the kid for something that really is a tic. Now, as we know, the tics are the main feature of Tourette syndrome. And a tic is basically described as an involuntary, repetitive motor movement or vocalization that you can't control. Well, we call them incontrollable, not uncontrollable, because in a lot of ways you can suppress, and we'll talk about that a little bit. What's interesting about the tics is that most people who don't know much about Tourette, if you see a simple motor tic, because there are actually two categories. You have simple ones and you have complex ones. And simple ones, like when you see me shaking my head back and forth, that's simple motor tic. It involves just one muscular group. I'm clacking my teeth, that would be a simple motor tic. If I'm blinking my eyes or stretching or twitching my nose or stretching my mouth or something like that, that's a simple motor tic. Those things usually look like tics. Unfortunately, at some point in a person's life, very, very large number of people get complex motor tics. And a complex motor tic is a complex movement that really doesn't often look like a tic. And they get mistaken for a lot of different things. Just some examples. I've seen kids with a hopping tic. We have a little guy that comes to our camp every year, and when he was about 7 years old, he's a little older now, he had a hopping tic. And now in second grade, they walk you everywhere. There's always a line, and walking kids from place to place. And poor little Connor, he'd take a few steps and then he would hop, and then a few steps and he'd hop. And the whole time they're walking to lunch or walking to specials, the whole class says, Connor, we're going to be the last ones on the lunch line. Connor, we're going to be late for PE. And the more stressed he gets about holding the line up, the worse the tic gets. And he's embarrassed. Everything about it is just making his life so difficult. And it was so cute because I was meeting with the two teachers, the regular ed and the special ed teacher and the mom, and it was before school, so he was sitting off in the corner of the classroom coloring. And the teacher looked at me and she said, gosh, I never would have thought of that as a tic. She said, now I really feel badly because I had no idea. She said, so what do I do about it? And I was going to make a suggestion, but over from the coloring corner of the room I hear, you could just put me at the end of the line. I said, thank you, Connor. I'm so glad we invited you. I mean, it was such a simple thing. And it's our, mindset to try to get them to stop doing it. They can't stop doing it. So I think when you're working with these kids, whether in an education setting, at home, whatever, you have to constantly be thinking about what I like to call environmental modifications. Why would you put the kid who's got a hop in the middle of the line where he holds everybody up? And I look at it from the teacher's point of view because I taught for so many years, but I also look at it from the point of view of the child who grew up with Tourette and how embarrassing it is to put yourself in that situation. I worked with a girl years ago who had a twirling tic, stand up and twirl and then sit down. Stand up and twirl and sit down. And the teacher kept saying, it's disruptive, it's disruptive. So I came in and observed the class, and I'll tell you immediately why it was disruptive. She was seated in the middle of the classroom, dead center. So, not only was it disruptive to the class, but as she stood up and had to twirl, and everybody can see her, she's highly embarrassed by it. So, just finding that, I just put her over, in the row by the door, put her over there on the side, so if she has to get up and twirl, then she'll get up and twirl. It's not such a big deal. And I think, and again, you can't do this without parental consent, but I really think that educating the other kids is almost mandatory with so many of these kids. The other kids, when you do an education program for them, are wonderful. I don't think I have ever had, or any of the youth ambassadors that we have that go out and do these programs, have ever had a bad experience. Once the kids understand what it is, they'll come up and apologize to the child. I mean, you saw it with when we talked to Lennon's kids, teachers. It just makes such a difference because everybody is on board and they understand it. But complex tics can be clapping. I worked with a boy years ago in Liverpool schools who clapped all the time, constantly clapped. And he had probably one of the worst teachers I've ever seen in my life, who was just intolerant of this clapping. It could be like a throwing motion. Touching tics are very common, where you have to touch things. I worked with a kid recently who, as he walked down the aisle of his classroom, he'd have to touch each child in that aisle on the shoulder. Now, you can imagine as he's going down the row, stop touching me, because the kids don't like that, but he can't stop doing it. And sometimes they have to touch things. Sometimes they have to touch themselves inappropriately. It's touch their private parts or something like that. There's a little boy I worked with the other day in this area who has that particular tic, and they're restraining him for it in a classroom setting. And it's just a tic, I could see it right away. I've seen it with several kids in my own family. So it could be sticking out your tongue. It could be a pinching. I think one of my favorite ones was tearing paper. It was such a strange tic. This kid just had to keep tearing paper. And the teacher had a rule that the only thing allowed on their desks while she was teaching was what they were working on. So I observed him in math, and of course, we started with tearing the corners off the math paper, and then we got deeper into the math paper, and before you know it, the math paper was all torn up. And then we went to reading, and he was tearing off corners of the reading book and getting into trouble. And finally, I just, talked to the teacher, and I said, I see you have a recycling bin. Could we just put a stack of recycling paper on his desk, put a little, a garbage can next to his desk, and let him tear that up? It was not causing any harm, but when you're tearing apart your textbook, yeah, it is causing some harm. So again, I think the best feature of an educator working with these kids is thinking outside the box. Thinking how can you adapt the environment to this child and what they're dealing with at this time. I think probably the most complex motor tic I have ever had to deal with was the child who had to stand on her hands. And I have literally never seen anything quite that complex. And it was one where she would stand on her hands, stiffen up her body for about 10 seconds, and then she would go back into her chair again. And we went in, her mother called me over the summer and said, do you think we need to go in and talk to the teachers before school starts? And I said, yes. If I were a teacher, I would want to know someone's going to stand on their hands in my classroom. And so we went in and met with everybody, the principal, the librarian, the teachers, to make sure that everybody was on board with it. And it was interesting because as I was explaining this tic to them, you could see them all going, she's going to what? What's going to happen? And this little 8-year-old, who is now a senior in high school, this little 8-year-old goes, you all look a little nervous. And they did look a little nervous. And, you know, she said, I've been thinking a lot about that tic since I got it this summer, and I think the best way to handle it is to put my desk and chair over by the classroom door, and I'll try my best to get out in the hall and do the handstand. And so it was so interesting when I came back 2 weeks later and school had started, and I was going to do a peer program for the kids. And this girl went on to be one of our youth ambassadors, actually, in our area. But I came back to do a program for the kids, and it was I was so pleased to see her desk by the classroom door, but also a gym mat next to her desk. And then she also had a big gym mat out in the hallway. So she had set the whole environment up so this kid could do this. We educated the other kids, and I didn't hear from that school until IEP season in the spring. And when they called me to tell me about the IEP meeting, I said, so she's probably not doing that tic anymore, right? And they go, no, she's still doing it. And I go, and the teacher says, and what? And that's the point we can get to if we just, make the environmental accommodations and educate everybody, and life goes on. That's just what it is. You can have echopraxia, where you have to repeat someone else's actions. That could be really tough in a classroom. If a teacher has certain mannerisms and you have to, imitate what the teacher's doing. Copropraxia, where you have to give obscene gestures. A little girl, his mom called me the other day, and this is her new tic. And she said, what do I do? And I said, well, that's going to be a tough one. So we talked a bit, and I said, do you think you would be able to get the same feeling by giving the peace sign? I said, just focus on that middle finger, because that's the one you really want to put up. Okay? And you know who it is? It's Tabitha. And honest, out of nowhere, she started doing that, and she really worked at it. And she said to me the other day that 90% of the time it works. She said, every now and then, I'll have to do this, but most of the time she can do it. So again, it's just kind of figuring out, it doesn't always work. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes to try to find another way to handle it. Now, I just want to mention that, you notice at the beginning of this last slide, it says multiple motor tics, although I haven't updated my slide. They have now changed that to 2 or more motor tics. Very rarely do we see somebody with just 2 motor tics, but that's the new diagnostic criteria. And the reason they say that is because there are actually 2 other tic disorders, milder tic disorders, that are related to Tourette, but they're not the full-blown disorder because they don't fit all the criteria. And the first one is actually called transient or passing tic disorder of childhood. And it's very prevalent. Probably 35% of school-age kids go through a passing tic disorder. And how that differs from Tourette is it's usually not a lot of tics. It could be, but usually it's 1 or 2 things, and they come on suddenly, and they'll last a few weeks or a few months, and then they disappear, and you never see them again. I mean, when I think back on my teaching days, I think of, yeah, absolutely, I saw kids who had passing tics. And they would be doing, a nose twitch or a vocal tic or something for a while, and then all of a sudden it would just go away, and you're kind of waiting for the next one, and nothing ever came. So it was probably just a passing tic disorder of childhood. And that does happen to a lot of kids. There's also one called, used to be called chronic, now it's called persistent motor and or vocal tic disorder. And what that is someone who would develop a tic or 2 in childhood. It doesn't change, but it doesn't go away. Now, I look around my family, and my mother's brother clearly had a persistent tic disorder. He had 2 tics. One of them was pulling up on his sleeve. He constantly, and then he would pull down on his sleeve, then he'd pull up on his sleeve. And when he got excited, that sleeve was going a mile an hour. And he had another one where he had to do this little, like that with his face. And that's, as long as I remember, that's the only thing he ever had. My mother had full-blown Tourette. He had 4 children. And 3 of his 4 children have full-blown Tourette. So, having that chronic or persistent motor tic disorder, it's just 1 or 2 things that, lasted, his whole life, never changed, but he's now genetically predisposed and passed it on to his children as full-blown Tourette. I did a school program in the Albany area about 7 or 8 years ago, and there was a teacher in the audience who throughout my entire presentation just nonstop clearing her throat. And I gave a break partway through the presentation, and she came up to me and kind of sheepishly looked at me and said, do you think I have a chronic tic disorder? I went, mm-hmm. I said, yes, I would say that is a good possibility. I'm not a diagnostician. And, I probably ruined her day, but it was so clear. And the next sentence she said to me, one of the reasons I really wanted to come to this presentation today is because my 7-year-old granddaughter was just diagnosed with full-blown Tourette syndrome. And I said, when did you start that tic? She said, I've been doing it since I was about 9 years old. She was 57 when I met her. It had never changed. It was always the throat clearing. So it's interesting. So that's why we now include that 1 in 100 people who have either Tourette full-blown with all the criteria or just a tic disorder of some sort. Now the second thing is you have to have at least one vocal tic. Vocal tics to me have always been the most difficult part of this disorder for the simple reason that you hear them. That's why they're called vocal tics. And the vocal tics, again, can be simple things or they can be much more complex vocal tics. Now a simple vocal tic is usually a noise that you make. And I can almost remember the grade I was in school with what tic I had. I could almost remember. 3rd grade, I whistled all through 3rd grade. And I remember my teacher sending me out to the hall, you really need to stop whistling. Sit out there till you can stop whistling. And I'd come back in the room and I'd be there 3 minutes and I'd whistle all over again. But I had no explanation for it. It could be a whistling sound. It could be a coughing. It could be a sniffing. That was my first vocal tic, constantly sniffing over and over and over again. That was the year that I had the Kleenex on my desk all year. Every day I had a new box of Kleenex on my desk. A screeching sound, an animal noise, a grunting sound, a throat clearing. Any noise. I'm working with a little guy right now. It's probably the first time I've seen this one. He has what I'm now calling his mumbling tic. The teacher will say something, go, you can imagine how the teacher is appreciative of that. And he's not saying anything at all, but he's got a mumbling tic. I've worked with kids with humming tics. Any noise that you make over and over again that's kind of out of the realm of normalcy of what's going on around you could definitely be a motor tic. But a vocal tic, a complex vocal tic, is something linguistically meaningful that you have to say. It's, a word or a phrase, like yelling out, I've got it, oh boy, now you've seen it. We have our camp every year that I've told you about. We call it Camp Tickapalooza. We kind of like that name. And the kids always tell me that they come to camp to tick shop. That's the favorite expression that they use. They come to tick shop. Because they tend, Tourette is very suggestible, and they do tend to, pick up occasionally tics from each other. And the vocal tics seem to be the ones that they pick up the most. And Friday night, you just expect it to be chaos. And it's not anything they're doing, it's just, one kid yells something out, then 5 more kids have to yell it out. And, there's such a variety of complex vocal tics. I'm just going to give you some examples from camp this year. We had one kid whose vocal tics are all foods. And anybody who goes to camp knows who I'm talking about. He'll go, lasagna, hot dogs. He was kind of focused on Vienna sausages this year. I don't know where he got that one from. Last year it was ramen noodles. He just had to yell out foods all the time. It was hysterical. We had another boy a few years ago whose tic was Bob Dole. He just had to yell out Bob Dole. And I said to him, I said, do you even know who Bob Dole is? And he said, no, but my dad talks about him a lot. And that kind of became his tic. I mean, they could be little phrases that you have to say. One of our camp counselors has a tic, and she's just a fabulous person. And her tic is whenever somebody starts talking to her, like I'll go up and say, hi, Rosie, how you doing? And she'll say, shut the fuck up. She has to say that. And I keep telling her, you're not making me feel very welcome. This is not very nice. But they could be so many different things. Vocal tics can be speech atypicalities, where you have to suddenly be talking and your voice will go up and then your voice will go back down again. Sometimes what appears to be a stuttering, that starts all of a sudden at 12 years old, and nobody starts stuttering for the first time at 12, so it's more likely to be some sort of a vocal tic. I think one of the ones that I find the most fascinating is kids who will suddenly start talking in a different accent. And that to me just mystifies me. You can understand how people get misdiagnosed. I mean, that's got such a schizophrenic air to it. I had a boy in my class years ago who came in one day speaking in a perfect British accent. Perfect. And at first I thought, well, I knew he had Tourette. Maybe he just watched a James Bond movie or something and is seeing how it sounds to talk in a British accent. 6 months later, he was still talking in the British accent. And one day, out of nowhere, he came in and he was speaking American English again. And we all welcomed him home, back to the continent. Gary? Gary is from England. So all these years, we thought you had Tourette, and that was just yeah, okay, there we go. Sometimes the intensity of their speech, anything that, I worked with a girl one year who had, her tic for a long time was baby talk. She had to just talk in baby talk. Just really unusual things. And I think probably the most unusual tics, there's one called echolalia, where you have to repeat what someone else says. Do you have that? Is it teachers or is it anything?
He repeats phrases but doesn't realize it, and then he rhymes them.
Yeah.
He was 3 or 4 called him the rhinoceros when he was a toddler.
Yeah, it's really a tough one. And I had a boy in my class one time who would repeat just the last 3 words of what I said. So if I said, okay, let's take our seats. You could have, you need a pencil and a piece of paper. And as much as I totally understand this disorder and have lived, thousands of years with it, it seems like, it took me a very, very long time to get used to that because it was like this constant echo. And then I can remember one day just saying to myself, well, the middle schoolers don't really listen to me when I say it the first time, so I'll say it the first time and I'll go, take it, Marty. But him repeat it a couple of times and then everybody listens to it. But it can be very difficult. Sometimes palalalia, where they have to repeat their own words. And I think the one that sadly has made Tourette famous, we're not happy that it's made us famous, but it's the tic that takes the form of any kind of involuntary utterance of a curse word or anything socially inappropriate, phrases, sentences. It could be a curse word, it could be an ethnic slur. Those are very common and very difficult. It could be a sexual comment. I've worked with a lot of kids that have those kind of things. And what's difficult about them is sometimes they're very random. I've had that symptom most of my life. I've gone through short periods of time when it goes away. Very few people have heard it because I camouflage it into anything and everything that I don't want people to hear. And I think I did that. People say, why did you try so much to camouflage it? And I said, I wanted to keep my job. I was a teacher. It's not good to be yelling out those terrible words across your classroom. Although my fellow teachers were very jealous that I could, swear at the 8th graders and get away with it, but I never used it. But I think, the tricky thing about this is that it basically is something that, it can develop any time. And, I remember the family here that is in the front that is coming from our chapter, their daughter, who is somewhere in the back at the moment, I'll talk about you, Willow, when she was in 1st or 2nd grade, she had 2 tics, which at the time you wouldn't have thought it was coprolalia, but for a 6-year-old, and she would yell out no to everything. If the teacher said, get started on your homework, no. Would you like a cookie? No. And then she'd take a cookie, And her other one was shut up, which at that age, that's the worst thing she could think of to say. And so those were her vocal tics. And then, unfortunately, once the kids get on the school bus, they get more colorful, pick up more interesting things. And I've worked with kids with such a variety of the coprolalia. It is extremely difficult. And my feeling is that if a child has a lot of coprolalia, it's significantly loud, that I think the whole school needs to be educated. Because, I'm working with a kid in the high school. I was in the middle school, but all my middle school kids fed into that particular high school. And he's a kid that has come to our camp. I went up to speak last week, and the principal had me come in to speak to the teachers, but he decided to make it a staff meeting. And he said, the teachers are kind of aware now that that's what's going on, but this kid is getting yanked out of the hallway. He is getting, plays, this year he's playing quarterback for the football team, and other coaches are insisting that he be taken off the field. And he said, people have to know. So he invited all the coaches. He's put together packets for the coaches of every single team that they play against. I mean, he's just done an amazing job putting all this together, because this kid said some really, really, really tough things. And the teachers weren't really, they were a little worried about how they handled it in class. And I said, well, first of all, I know this boy, and he has a good sense of humor about it. And I said, he's highly embarrassed by it. He doesn't want to be saying these things. He's a good kid. And the teacher said, well, here's what happened the other day. It was history class, and she was asking the kids, what state is a neighbor state to another state? And she said, I looked at him, and he started to answer and said, fucking Canada. And she said, I didn't know what to do. I said, well, what did you do? She said, I looked at him, I said, no, that's not the right one. I'll give you another chance to get the right one. And just kind of, passed it over as nothing. And I said, and what was his reaction? She said, he laughed. And he looked so relieved that I was able to do that. So I think it's sometimes your reaction to it. You set the tone in that classroom with if you react, then that's how the other kids are going to react. If you punish, then that gives the other kids permission to think they can get after that child for something that they can't control. So you can see the vocal tics are all over the place. That particular symptom is not necessary for a diagnosis. It's a minority of people with Tourette that actually get that symptom, but it is definitely one of the more difficult ones that kids have to deal with. The next thing you're looking for are what we call waxing and waning. And that has two meanings. First of all, it means that the tics naturally change, especially in childhood. They change quite frequently. I mean, it's always fun every year to see the kids at camp to see what new tics they've had since the last time I saw them. They could be doing such and such, and then they come, even 6 months later, and everything changes, and that's very challenging. But besides just changing the nature of the tic, also the severity of it changes based on certain environmental factors. And the things that tend to aggravate tics the most and make them more severe are stress, anxiety, and excitement. Those are the three biggies, when there's a stressful situation. The week before we had our camp this year, I probably had 6 or 7 schools call me and said, I'm just seeing this flurry of tics. He's banging his head on the desk. He's doing such and such. And I said, it's camp week. So why don't we just wait till next week and let's see how things are going. They were excited about coming off to see their friends, at camp for the week. And so all of a sudden, everything started accelerating. If they have a test, if there's a stressful situation going on at school. A lot of kids get worse when they're tired. That happens a lot. You'll see many more tics toward the end of the day than you will at the beginning of the day. Sometimes kids get worse when they're sick. And one thing that I have noticed over and over and over and over again is a lot of kids' tics get worse when they overheat. And I think it has something to do with the sensory piece. It's just my theory on it. But unfortunately, it's tough because there are a lot of places in school where the room is too hot, or you have to go out to PE and run around, and the symptoms tend to rev up. And so there are probably, I'm thinking of about 15 or 16 IEPs that I've worked on very recently, where we have as one of their accommodations that they, after PE or sometimes after lunch because the cafeteria is hot, that they go down to the nurse, and the nurse puts an ice pack on their neck to cool their body temperature down, and that kind of calms the tics down. And so, it's, again, looking at what's the trigger, how do we deal with this and get this, so it's not quite so bad. Back to the other side, tics change much more frequently in childhood. I have tics right now that I've had for 30 years. They just do not go away. And some of them I would give anything to get rid of, like the teeth clacking, because it's destroyed all my teeth. I have no bottom teeth from here back. It's a really, really difficult tic to have, but it just doesn't want to go away. Very rarely do I get a new one, but probably about a year and a half ago, I got a new tic, which is unusual, and you'll see me doing this constantly. I call it my Valley Girl tic. And all I know is by the end of the day, this side of my hair is fine, and this side is, sticking out about 10 inches on this side, because I'm constantly flicking it all day long. My hairdresser thinks, he's convinced that this side of my hair grows faster. I go, yeah, I get it, I understand. But you know, the other thing that we see pretty consistently is that many kids will worsen, the symptoms worsen starting in pre-puberty and continuing sometimes on into puberty. You know, a lot of kids, I mean, I have to say that when I look at the schools that I go into, a lot of them are middle and early high school, where you're suddenly getting that upsurge of symptoms that didn't happen before. Interestingly enough, my tics did not get worse at that age, but my OCD got out of control. It was just, I don't know how my mother allowed me to live. I really don't, but God bless her, she did. And people say to me, I have a child with Tourette, and I'll say, my mother had 6. What are you worried about? And you know, it was really, really hard. And the good news is, as I said before, many people experience a lessening of tics in adulthood. It's pretty common, and I see it across my family. Not everybody, but it's fairly common that happens. Whoops, I already went to that one, sorry. You know, the other criteria is fairly simple, and that is that this is a disorder of childhood onset. It can begin in childhood anywhere between the ages of 2 and 18. I do see kids as young as 2 or 3. I had a great nephew diagnosed last year at 3, and it's pretty young, but you know, when you got everybody in the family with it, you spot it. What I loved is his dad, my nephew's response was, I didn't think he'd get this. And I go, do you have this? And he goes, yes. I said, do you know anybody else in the family that does? He goes, yeah, you, Aunt Judy, Uncle Jack, Uncle Tom. I said, keep going. So you didn't think he would get it. Okay, well, dream on. But you know, it often starts, anytime in that time frame, but it often starts between 5 and 8. That's a fairly classic thing. It's also fairly common for it to start around the face. You know, an eye blinking or a nose twitch or some sort of a facial grimace of some sort. It doesn't have to, but that's fairly common. And you know, if you're in an area where you've got good doctors and you're going to get the diagnosis, it's wonderful because there's nothing better than early intervention for these kids. You know, when you get everybody in and educated and you get the testing done and you give them the accommodations and whatever they need, it's a huge difference than waiting till they're, 14 or 15, as you heard some of our panelists say this morning, or waiting until you're 36 when I was already finished my formal education. So it does make a big difference. This next slide I added a couple of years ago to my PowerPoint. You know, I talked a little bit about the series of events that led up to my diagnosis 30 years later. It was a long 30 years. I just found this picture very recently. This is me at 7 years old, and this is the year I got diagnosed with the too long baying syndrome. Okay, the tic that I had that year was I can't even do it with these, jerking my head backward really, really hard, and I would snap my neck. And we had gone to the allergist, we'd gone to the eye doctor, we're going through the litany of doctors. And my mother took me back to the family doctor and he said, oh, clearly, it's because you've let her bangs get too long. And that's why she's doing that. So you notice my bangs are, like up here. And my sister to this day tells me she's still in therapy because whatever haircut I got, she got the same one. And she didn't have Tourette at that time. But I can remember she would constantly be cutting my bangs so short. Did it help the tic? No. No, it did not. That's just what it was. The other thing that you again, and we talked about this earlier, is because there is a milder tic disorder, referred to as passing or transient tic disorder of childhood, doctors want to give it a good year before you actually give the diagnosis, just in the odd chance that it might be just passing tics. I think by the time you get to the year, if the tics have changed significantly, if there's worsening under stress and whatever, if there are a lot of other factors going into it that are leading you, there's motor and there's vocal, it probably is Tourette. But I think just to kind of rule out the passing tics, they usually wait for the year. Now, what's interesting, and we heard one of our panelists talk about this morning, is kids have the ability for very limited amounts of time to hold in, to suppress their symptoms. It is never something to encourage a child to do, because a couple things happen. The more you hold it in, the worse it gets. And you get off the bus at the end of the day, and it's an absolute nightmare. You're ticking so badly that you can't possibly get homework done. You can't possibly accomplish anything. It's just to the extreme sometimes. But I think also, one of the biggest things it does is it takes away your ability to concentrate on anything except holding the tics in. And the analogy I use is, imagine if I told you for the next 15 seconds, you are not allowed to blink your eyes. Everybody could do that. You could do it. It's really hard, but you could do it. However, the minute I say, now you can blink your eyes, that's what you're going to do. And if all the while you're trying not to blink your eyes, I keep talking to you, are you really listening to me? No, you're trying not to blink your eyes. And that's what happens with kids who try to suppress symptoms. So why do we try to suppress them? Because they're embarrassing. Because you get kicked out of places. Because, I've been kicked out of libraries, I've been kicked out of church. I always tell people I don't go to church anymore, God understands. I've been put off airplanes, I've had some significant tics over the years. And I think that, you try so hard to suppress them for that reason. And it just becomes second nature to try to do that. And so probably the number one thing that I put on every IEP or 504 plan is breaks. I mean, all it takes is to allow that child to have a special pass, to take a break, walk down the hallway, get a drink of water, do a phony errand, whatever it is that you have to do. And it accomplishes a couple of things. First of all, it gives them that more private setting to get their tics out, rather than doing it in the classroom and being embarrassed. And I think also that, it's kind of been, I've read many articles about how the exercise component does actually change the level of the dopamine in your brain. And it can help tics. But the key to it, I always tell kids, don't just lumber across the hall to get a drink of water. Take a brisk walk. Step up the speed and walk real briskly around the perimeter of the inside of the building. And it really does help them come back and be able to settle in more in their classroom. So it's a simple thing, but it really does help, because trying to suppress them is not the answer to it. And again, they get off the bus and things are crazy. Classroom suggestions. I have a whole article that it's going to be one of your handouts. It's called Classroom Accommodations. And a few things from there. Breaks, preferential seating. Please don't put the child who has very obvious tics in the center of your classroom, or even in the front row of your classroom. On the side, a lot of kids need to be to their front because of their ADHD, but it's so important to put them in a place where they're less embarrassed. And believe me, it can be very embarrassing. So up front, on the side, assessing the interference of individual tics to come up with some sort of an accommodation for it. I always tell teachers, if there's a tic that's very loud or very complex motor tic that is much more obvious, right away you think, how is that disrupting the child? But if you have a tic, like my first grade tic of eye blinking, nobody thinks it's causing any problem because it's not disrupting the class, but the child is disrupted. I mean, the two tics that I've had, three of them really, that have been the most disruptive but really hardly anybody notices, head shaking tic. Try to read when your head is shaking. I had a second grader recently said to me, well, why don't you shake the book this way and your head this way? I said, that sounds like a good idea, but I don't think I'm going to try that. I don't think that's going to work. It gets in the way of what you're trying to get done. It's also one of my more embarrassing ones because it always looks like you're saying no. You're in the front row of the superintendent's meeting in September, and everything the superintendent is saying, you're going, looks like you're disagreeing with them. My students used to call that my no tic. Can I go to the bathroom? Yes. Then I'd shake my head back and forth. Just looking at, if wrist twisting tic, how do you write? This one interrupts my writing terribly because I'm constantly hitting my finger on things. So sometimes it's not a thing that disrupts anyone else, but it can be very disruptive to that child. Educating the other kids, we already talked about that, critical, and we have a wonderful youth ambassador program all over the country, and every one of the New York chapters has youth ambassadors that come out to the schools and talk to the other kids. They're well trained, they all go to a training either in DC or somewhere else in the country. And for sometimes I've run into kids over the years that have significant vocal tics that can be very loud and disruptive, and even as an educator I have to admit it would be very difficult to teach a class. One of the kids I worked with, and he's come back to our camp all the time, he had a loud screeching tic when he was a junior in high school. It was ear piercing. And it was also happening every 20 seconds. I mean, I'm thinking, how would I teach a class if he's doing that? So we set up a couple of things for him. The first thing we set up is a Skype room. And I have used this on a number of occasions. It's a room, it could be a back office in the guidance office where you can set up Skype, or now on the Google Chrome platform, they have Google Hangouts. And what you do is you turn that on in the classroom, and then you bring the child, let the child go to, of their own will, go to the other classroom, turn on the video in there, and they can watch the class, but people can't hear their tics. And a lot of kids say to me that what that accomplishes is two things. First of all, less disruption to the class, but probably even more importantly, this one girl said to me one time, and it's really stuck with me for a long time. She said, when my tics start getting really, really bad, I know that I have only one choice, and that's to go home. Because I'm so disruptive, I can't possibly stay in school. And she said, and the more I think about I'm going to have to go home and miss the rest of the day, the more stressed I get, it's a vicious cycle, the worse the tics get. So knowing that if she wanted to pick up her things and go to her Skype room and sit down and turn Skype on in the classroom, I'm telling you, it just lessened the stress to such a point. When we first set it up, she was using it 4 and 5 times a day. And by the end of about 3 or 4 weeks, she was using it 2 or 3 times a week. I mean, it just reduced the stress enough to calm her tics down, and then she knew that she had another option. She didn't have to necessarily go home. So sometimes, for more, difficult tics like that, I think, to me, ignoring is probably the best thing. When I do an observation, I have a checklist that I created, and in one column it has classroom interruptions. And believe me, I've been in education long enough, I know them all. Somebody sharpens a pencil, somebody blows their nose, somebody coughs, sneezes, drops their pencil on the floor, drops their book on the floor, falls off their chair, intercom comes on. These are normal things in any classroom. And, I'll keep track anytime anything disrupts that classroom. And on the other column, I keep track of the child's vocal tics. I've never done that and if anybody wants it, I have it on my computer. I've never had an instance where the vocal tics are not, the classroom interruptions are not 3 to 4 times the number of the actual vocal tics. And when you know what it is, it's not a big deal. Like I say, somebody coughs, somebody sneezes, somebody yells out Bob Dole, and on we go. And you just get used to it. This one student I had in my class, and I like to use him as an example. When I had him, I was a French teacher, so I tended to have kids all 4 years when they were in middle school. And I had him in 5th grade, and his vocal tics that year were animal noises. And I was one of those we were an academic subject, but not so important a teacher. I don't know if you know, but in schools there are 4 important teachers: math, science, social studies, English. Those are the important ones. And everybody else is not quite as important. So we don't find things out as soon as everyone else. So I'm taking attendance my first day in that 5th grade class, and I'm hearing mooing and meowing and barking, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm not making those noises. Somebody else in this room has got to have Tourette syndrome. And I recognized that he had a lot of head twisting, so I said nothing to him. But by the end of his first day in middle school, as a 5th grader, he got kicked out of 4 places. And you really can't blame teachers. The art teacher didn't know. The cafeteria monitor didn't know. The PE teacher didn't know. And if you've got a kid making constant animal noises and you ask them to stop and they don't, that's a normal thing to ask them to leave the room. And so it really became very problematic. Fortunately, we got him eventually back in school again. When he was in 6th grade, he developed a more complex vocal tic, and he would say, "Chickens are fuzzy, chickens are fuzzy." He just had to keep repeating that phrase. That's pretty mild. I've certainly heard a lot worse. We dealt with chickens are fuzzy with no problem. When I had him in 8th grade, I had him first period, and one day I went to my computer before my homeroom came in, and there was a note from his mom, an email, and all it said was, "Interesting new tic." I'm like, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready for this. So the homeroom gets out, the first period class comes in, and by the time I got attendance taken and settled, I'd kind of forgotten about that. Interesting new tic. And I'm teaching, and all of a sudden from the side of my classroom I hear, "I got a chicken in my pants." Yes, that is a very interesting new tic. But what I loved about that day, and it's why I tell the story all the time, by the time I had him in 8th grade, everybody knew. Everybody knew Marty had Tourette. It was not a big deal in our school. And the day he yelled that out, the 8th grade boy sitting next to him turned around and went, "Wow, Marty, great new tic." and that was the end of it. And the only time anybody ever noticed that tic, I mean, if he'd yell it out, the kids are doing their work, I'm teaching, like we didn't even hear it. If a visitor came in the room, and the kids used to put me up to pretending that, we weren't hearing it, and to make the visitor nervous. So, I could go for a good joke in class, so sometimes I would do that, and the visitor would be like, "Didn't anybody else hear that?" Am I starting to hear things? And I wouldn't say a word. But you can get to that point in the classroom if everybody understands. I mean, that was a very bizarre tic. And I asked him, I said, did you pick that up from somewhere? Where did that come from? And he said, the morning it started, I was eating cereal watching a cartoon, and there was a cartoon character who was yelling out, "I got a chicken in my pants, I got a chicken in my pants," and it just stuck in his head. And he had that tic all the way through 8th grade into 9th grade. It did not go away. So, just by educating everybody and keeping everybody on board. And the one last thing, I'm going to bring it up very, very briefly. Probably about 10 years ago, I discovered, and it's something that we use rarely, but it has been a godsend to many kids. It's something called some places call it a silencer, some call it a steno mask. It is created by a company called Talk Tech, and they contacted me one time because a boy had called them from the University of San Francisco and wanted to know if they thought this particular device would help in the classroom, because he was in college and he was experiencing a lot of vocal tics. And what you do with this thing, court stenographers use it to take dictation, and you put it just over your mouth, and it's all made of rubber and vinyl. It completely muffles what you say. I mean, I tried it on this little boy who was loud, every 10 seconds, screeching sound, and this is what you would hear. Now, without it, you were knocked off your chair. And he started, now we ordered it, but we asked them if they could send it without the tape recorder and the cords and everything, because we don't really want to tape our tics. That's fine. And he started using it. It fits in the palm of your hand. You can put it in your pocket. And he found that so helpful. He said it's not going to work 100% of the time, which I don't expect it will, but it certainly made it more capable for him to go to movies, to sit in a full-length class. I would never force a child to use it, but some kids willingly just carry that with them, and it does make a difference. And I loved it when I went to the website about maybe 6 months later, they now advertise this particular device for kids with Tourette syndrome as a tool, just another thing in your arsenal of tools that you might want to use, and they credit the Greater New York State chapter for putting it there. So, and again, it's a drastic measure, but I know some kids that they won't go to school without it. It's so comforting to them to know. I have one. They gave me one for free, and I use it at the movies because I can't go to movies otherwise. So, it really might help some kids. I'm going to skip the video clip for now. I put this picture up because people ask me all the time, how did I get where I am at this, ripe old age, having gone 30 years, all through my formal education, et cetera, without, and survive without knowing what I had. This is the reason right here. I grew up, as I said before, in the very rural Adirondack Mountains in a town called, I'm sure you've never heard of it, Chasm Falls, New York. If anybody's heard of it, I'll fall right over. And at the time I was there, and I'm really not 110 years old, at the time I was there was no centralized education. So we went to these one-room schoolhouses. This was from my elementary school right here. And I went there for 6 years. There were 6 grades in that room, one teacher. It was the same teacher every year for 6 years. Mrs. Pocan was her name. She's the only teacher I ever knew up till 7th grade. In that school, the most students we ever had was 17. And of the 17, 5 of them were myself and my sisters and brothers. And we all had Tourette. So we tell people now, they made fun of you if you didn't have Tourette in that school. And the teacher, my brothers had hyperactivity. She saw the noises. She saw everything, heard the noises. She saw the tics. She taught us with her heart. And she is the reason I became a teacher. I wouldn't be a teacher. You wouldn't have been a teacher in my life had it not been for her. Because she just, she saw me and she didn't see the symptoms. But, it was really a wonderful education. The schoolhouse is still there. It's no longer, somebody turned it into a little chalet and purchased it. But I was really glad that they left a school bell outside. Okay, so it's still hanging on the front door. But I mean, this is really why I am where I am today. When I got into middle school or junior high, as they called it back then, life was much more difficult because I was now the only one in my class, and I was still undiagnosed, so it was much more difficult. Any questions at this point? Yes.
There's a fine line between taking breaks is definite recommendation.
Right.
But somebody with Tourette and ADHD, for example, has comorbidity, where you see we students almost take that taking a break as a luxury and
Right.
use it.
Well, I've had kids, accused of using their breaks. One of the things I've set up for kids as they get a little bit older, maybe 10, 11 or older, is I ask the teacher to give them 7 break cards every day. Like, here are your 7 cards, and they have to last you the day. And what I want them to do is to start learning how to self-manage. When do I need a break, or when do I just like to get out of the classroom because I'm bored? And I always tell the kids, remember, the end of the day is going to be worse. So make sure you have a couple left for the last classes because it's going to be a much more difficult time. It really, one kid said to me, with Tourette, I feel like I don't have control. My body's out of control. My mind is often out of control with the OCD. And this puts some of the control back in my hands again. Because I know I've got these break cards, and all they have to do is leave it on their desk. Teachers collect it, and the next morning they get their 7 cards back. Some teachers use tokens, It really does make a difference, and then they have to learn, how many they have. And like if you use 3 in the first half hour, you're going to be, it's going to be a little tough toward the end of the day because you probably didn't need 3 first thing in the morning. So.
It brings me to my next, it's like my son personally, that's what the teachers felt that he was drinking too much, and then he had to earn.
Right.
They set up an earning system, so you need less than 5 reminders, you get to go to the same.
Right.
And then the other question I have is about educating peers.
Yeah.
I'm getting mixed feedback from family, from parents, from teachers.
Right.
Some say, yes, educate them, and that's how I feel.
Right.
Some say, if you educate your peers, it might draw more attention.
Right. No, I think that, the program that I did for years before we had the Youth Ambassador Program, and it's actually incorporated into the Youth Ambassador Program because I was working for TAA when they created that program, and I wrote that program. It's all about differences. I start talking about, how we're all different, and we look about, who has brown hair, who has, blue eyes, who has just exploring how different. And I will say to kids, imagine if you come in school tomorrow and every single person in the room looks exactly like this guy right here. And of course they'll all giggle and laugh. But, I'll say, what would be difficult about that? Why would that not be a good thing? And they'll say, well, we wouldn't know who anybody was. We'd all have to wear name tags and the teacher would be confused. And, I think the thing is that we tend to tease and make fun of our differences instead of celebrating them. We're all unique people, and if we just celebrate our differences, and then I work my way into other things that people know more about. Like I often talk about asthma. Who knows what asthma is? If anybody's ever seen anyone have an asthma attack, what would you do if a child in your class were suddenly using an inhaler? And they'll say, well, nothing. We know he can't help it. Right. Would you ever make fun of somebody who has an asthma attack? No, never. And then I work my way into Tourette. Now I have an advantage when I do this myself because I have Tourette, and I'll ask the kids if they can pick out things that I had been doing that look a little unusual, and they find tics I don't even have. I get very annoyed, like, no, I don't do that. And, I'll ask them, why do you think I'm doing that? I mean, why do you think I'm shaking my head back and forth, or why am I clacking my teeth, or why am I whatever? And we just explore, we figure out what part of our body is causing this. It's our brain, and we talk about, and just when you work into it, it just becomes another thing that people get. Some people get asthma, some people get diabetes, some people have allergies, some people have Tourette. And we're so lucky now that we have role models, around the country that, have come forward and talked about, like Tim Howard, who is a soccer goalie who played for the World Cup team on 2 different occasions for the USA, and he's been very, very prominent in, talking about Tourette. People that people recognize. So I think it's how you do it, and I think the program that we have through TAA is very much like that. I mean, it very much talks about, differences and how everybody's different and just explains it. And I think it makes such a difference. Kids, I think everybody in this room knows that kids will tease, make fun of, and actually fear what they don't understand. I mean, yeah.
I used to be late clinical time for my son when he was doing that accident. And the overwhelmingly large proportion of the feedback from teachers and parents afterwards was that it was very helpful.
Right.
Only once or twice did we get, it wasn't helpful or it made things worse because it drew attention. Generally, it very much helped the situation.
Yeah.
Feels understood.
Yeah.
One in particular where the child was being bullied mercilessly at the school day. The person that was doing it was then the instigator, and she was very vocal, asking lots and lots of questions, clarifying questions during the presentation. When the teacher was telling back was being did, and was saying she was finding it really interesting, and she was asking so many questions. And then about a month later, I got an email from the teacher saying she personally observed who had been bullied standing up for even their
Wow. Yeah.
So there's a good turnaround story.
Yeah. I think once you tell kids they're fine, it's not the mystery. People used to say to me, once I, found my diagnosis, up to that point I had no idea what I had, they would say to me, would you tell the kids? And I would say to them, yeah. As soon as somebody asked about it, which was 90% of the time, 99% of the time the first day of school, why do you keep doing that? I mean, middle school kids can be a little cruel at times. And I'd explain it to them, and that was kind of the end of the issue. And I run into former students now all the time, and they just say, yeah, we noticed it, but we knew what it was, and it just wasn't a big deal. It wasn't who you were. And, everybody just, we knew you had it. But I think sometimes it's just taking the elephant out of the center of the room, to use a cliche. Let's just put it out where it is and let people know. And people are usually really, really good about it. I've seen kids apologize to other kids. My stance in life is when I am anywhere where I don't know people, I tell them instantly. I don't go into a great big long explanation, but I just, on an airplane, if it's a long trip, I'll say, I've got Tourette syndrome, so before the plane takes off, you might want to move. This is your last chance to get out of the seat next to me so I don't drive you nuts the whole trip. But, I think just, being the openness about it is kind of puts people off sometimes. Like she's not, I'm no longer embarrassed by it. I've gotten to the point where this is who I am. I had a lady down in Louisiana one time. I was doing a big program down there. And I had set the stage up and all my equipment and everything, and I came out and sat outside because it was warm. And the teachers were all filing into the auditorium for a presentation. And one lady coming to the presentation walked up to me, and I was doing my usual 30-year teeth clacking, and she came up to me and said, wow, you got some really bad dentures. And, I'm thinking to myself, even not knowing that I have Tourette, that's rude. That's pretty rude, okay. But my friend who was traveling with me said, why did you say something? I said, I think she'll figure it out eventually. So I got, the people were all in the auditorium, and I walked across the stage to the podium, and she just happened to be in the second row, and she looked at me and went, like, oh my God. I think if I could count the number of times she apologized to me in the course of that day, it was a good 15 times. She was so embarrassed. And, it's just, that's what it is. I said, listen, that's hardly the worst thing that's happened to me in my life. That's nothing. So I think you got to put it in perspective. Now, we're going to take a break in a couple of seconds, but, we mentioned earlier that Tourette syndrome is now commonly called a spectrum disorder. And an extremely large number of people with Tourette are also diagnosed with associated disorders. And I want to spend a little bit of time, although we don't have lots and lots of time, talking about each of them and explaining, what it looks like. I think sometimes even parents, it's hard to sort out, what's an associated disorder, what's this, is it behavioral, is it, purposeful? So just to talk a little bit about it, but the three biggies, and we'll start with those first, are OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, very, very common with Tourette syndrome. I was diagnosed with OCD when I was diagnosed with Tourette quite a few years ago now. And I remember back then there was just nothing on the market. There were no medications for OCD. And I remember the doctor was in Rochester saying to me, "You have pretty significant OCD and good luck." That's not very helpful, you know. I've been tremendously helped with cognitive therapy and medication, and my level of OCD is significantly better at this point than it ever has been in my life. It really is. I mean, mine was debilitating at times. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, very, very common in kids with Tourette, and learning disabilities, but often in what we call the nonverbal areas, which we'll talk about. Those are the three biggies, okay? So we'll talk about those first, but then we have this other list, okay? Executive dysfunction, depression, anxiety disorders, sleep disorders, fine motor difficulties, aggressive or explosive behaviors, sensory defensiveness, auditory processing, social skills deficits, and sometimes overlapping with the autism spectrum disorder. And we're going to talk about each of these after the break for a little bit each one. I don't have a lot of time. And then we'll have our panel come up at the end. So why don't we take a few minutes, maybe till 3:30 if we could. I believe they've delivered more cookies. And if you're not sick of cookies yet, and there's more coffee out there. So everybody take a stretch break and then come on back. Oh, you're welcome.
It's an honor to hear you live. I've watched many of your videos.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for making the trip.
Of course.
Safe drive back.
Yes.
Hopefully it will be not too bad.
Is there a place outside to make sure you have my email for the
I have it on the
slides?
registration list.
But I only
Oh,
registered
that's right.
for the
You know what?
morning.
And I don't have it with me, but I'm going to ask
Well,
you.
I've emailed with you before.
Yeah, tell me your
but
first name.
Jessica Fulton.
Okay, I have it. I
Are you
remember.
sure?
Oh, yeah,
Should I give it to
absolutely.
you somewhere?
If you want to write it down on a slip of paper, here. That's not me doing right there. Because I will add it to the registration list when I go out.
Sue, up here.
Yes? Oh, yes.
No cookies, no water up here.
Really?
Is it down there?
No. They're supposed to be here by 3 o'clock.
No.
Sorry. There's coffee still. But he's coffeeed out.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah, they were due here at 3 o'clock. The guy who brought lunch told me they were coming back. Oh, you're welcome. It's trying to normalize it, you know what I'm saying?
What's normal?
You know what I'm saying? It's normal.
You know,
So I'm just signing, I'm still listening, I have to sign
I know.
myself.
You just do it like a sign.
Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. And you know, I think people say to me all the time, how have you gotten this far? Well, if I didn't have a sense of humor, I would not be here today. You have to, and if you don't develop with this disorder, you'll never survive. And some of even our youngest kids, you know, that we work with and come to camp and we get involved in activities, it's amazing how they develop with such an age. You know, and it just makes them feel so good, like it's something that's so painful in my life, and I could actually, you know, I could actually, How old is he?
He's now synonymous with diagnose. Over and over.
When they're young like that, it's very difficult.
I will always be very special procedure.
Yeah.
And yes, I did education team as well. Sneezing is involved.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's sometimes hiccuping, sneezing. There are so many
Those
different
are the two
examples. Yeah,
examples that
I use them all the time. It just makes such a difference.
I was
Because,
just like,
you
I
know,
want to go into current laws, I was just essentially improve and transition to the school. Sometimes your assistance from the teachers, or I don't know if she gets it. So she's also, I think, she's further against it in ways. So it's like, there's a fine line between providing professional education versus then coming up and bathing my child, but I'm so far from bathing.
no, and that's the mindset of teachers. We sometimes tend to, want to look at everything as behavioral, and they can help it if they want to. And it's just kind of changing the way they look at this disorder. That's, the information is important, but I mean, sometimes it's just changing the way they look at
Like, well,
kids.
I want to
Yes.
just what teachers get motivation.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And signing attendance certificates.
Oh,
so
thank
just in
you.
case.
This is amazing. I heard you're famous, and
Oh! I don't know about that.
you mentioned one. Okay, so my kids and one of the things you mentioned is an awkward thing, but you're pretty out here.
Yeah.
So private touch.
Oh, and it's so common.
Is that part
Oh
of?
my God, Jen. It's so common. I was just
See,
in
I
school
didn't know that.
Thursday.
Right.
Are you from this area?
No, Washington D.C.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
kind of goes outside of Phillips, so I
Yeah.
stopped.
It's
But-
just,
So that's
it's one of the
another.
most common things.
Uh,
Yeah. And
I don't know if I'm relieved or.
I know. But
Well, I didn't
it's,
know what that.
this year was just was on Thursday in this area. We're restraining.
I don't want to.
What?
That's a little. Well, so I didn't realize. Okay, so to me, until you gave us the laundry
Right,
list,
right.
she's been doing like, you don't even want to know what, like 1.5. I mean, she was in a stroller. I was
Right,
like, what's
right.
happening? I mean, she wasn't physically kind
Right.
Anyway, long story. Now she's not. So like I was able to ignore it
Yes,
because she's
yes.
a little kid, and
Yeah.
you could like.
Yeah.
I remember one time we're watching her something soccer. Again, she was 4 or 5. I covered her with a blanket. I
Yeah,
knew what I'm
nobody
going to
knew.
do. Now she's like
Oh, yeah.
kid. So she doesn't happen. I'll have to check in on this. I'm pretty sure it's not happening today.
Yeah,
But it's in a home setting.
yeah, yeah.
And one issue is it's around his son, which is getting weird, right? Because he's old.
Yeah.
So,
You might have to explain to him that it's just a tick.
so that's what it is. So it's
Yeah.
not another.
My nephew has had it his whole life. He still has it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I work with so many kids who have tics. Even worse, I work with kids who have tics where they inappropriately touch other people.
Right.
Oh,
right.
that's
Oh, that's a whole other.
Oh my God, I could tell you stories.
You must have
It
seen it all.
really has to. You really have to.
I didn't. Okay, so again, like she was, I guess around 7 or 8 had these other tics, but I didn't know that until today. Thank you. See, this is why you're here. I just thought that was another weird thing. I was like, that's weird, but I classified it differently. So it's not part of something else.
No, it's a tick.
But it's so. Oh,
It's,
okay.
I've
No, I don't know why I'm
100 kids
wondering.
with that too. We had 2 or 3 kids at camp this year. Yeah.
So it's all part of.
One kid was touching his rear end over and over again. Just kept riding
So,
his rear end.
so what do you do? Is there
Many
anything?
kids say eventually it changes to something else,
Right.
but sometimes it takes longer than others. So it's just kind of
So-
riding it out. Sometimes you can try, like I mentioned, this instead of doing this, but it's sometimes hard to substitute.
Well,
But I,
I just thought it was at the wrong time.
right?
So I thought it was something else.
Yeah.
But you're
Yeah,
saying
and that's
it's-
what most people think it is.
But it's not. It's
Yeah, one of the
that's-
kids was
okay.
12 and he was doing it, and
Oh,
they
man.
kicked him off the school bus, and they called and charged him with sexual harassment because he was doing it on the bus. And I said, who's he harassing? I mean,
Right,
and he
right.
was just sitting in his seat, and like over quickly, over and over again.
Oh, no.
I had to go in, and it was just awful.
So it's never been classified as anything else. I know, I'm still trying. I know you know what you're talking about, but I'm like, you're the last
Sometimes
stop.
there's an obsessive component to some of the tics.
Oh,
It's
so they might be
yeah,
an
it could be a little bit crossing over into that, but there's, we talked about the coprolalia and the copropraxia. I read an article recently they called the copra phenomena, and it's to do with tics like this that are so inappropriate. Like whether it's a curse word, if it's...
This is just another inappropriate tic, but a physical.
Yeah. And we're getting...
I don't know whether to cry or not.
Really, you can draw obscene pictures.
Wow.
And that's part of that whole thing. There's a name for it.
You're sure about that?
Yeah. I wish I was, but...
Well,
yeah.
I've never mentioned it because...
Yeah, that's, most people look at it completely...
I don't want to know, I don't want to think about it. But,
But she might feel better if she knows that that's all it is.
Oh.
She might be just so embarrassed by it.
So you're saying that's in the group of tics that could go away? I mean, it's just...
Oh, absolutely. Because a lot of them do. They change frequently. You see that all the time, and that is one that could very easily just disappear.
Yeah, because that won't work as an apple.
My nephew still has it. He's off and on his whole life. He's in his 30s now. Yeah.
So how does... I don't
Well,
know.
he's a pharmacy assistant
Oh my God.
at the local pharmacy, and he says, I just stay behind the counter. Well, that's what he tells me all the time. I go, good thinking, Jason.
I don't know why I keep thinking it would be something, but I never mentioned it to the pediatrician because I didn't know
Right, exactly.
what to do. And then often my daughter now again, that she's aware, she's like, we're not going to talk about that. I'm like, no, because I still don't think it's mine. But like I said, it's becoming more difficult because of the presence of my husband. And, it's
Right,
just not.
right, exactly. Well, it's
I don't
embarrassing
know.
because it's a socially difficult thing. It's no different than yelling out a curse word, because it's so socially so inappropriate. But I think that,
Okay.
those are the kind of tics I feel like I was crying in press.
So, but that seems part of
It's
it.
in my book. I've done a whole story.
Oh, really? Oh, so look. Okay, so I'll look at on the web. Do you have your own website or something, or you're
I
kind of
know,
in
I
charge
just
of this
mostly
whole
the
system?
chapter
Okay.
website, yeah.
So I'll look at
Yeah,
that.
just type my name into the,
So no other.
you go on Amazon, it's
I'll
available.
find stuff. But there's no other. What I was saying is like no other condition that will take this one in. Yeah, I don't know why I was separated from this, but oh wow. Okay.
I
Well,
wish.
this was a
Yeah,
wake-up
it's an
call.
eye-opener in a lot
Yeah,
of ways, yeah.
right. I mean, there were a lot of things. I feel like I'm still learning where it's like each day I'm like, oh, I didn't know that because the list is so long.
Right, it is.
So she
Yeah.
does the, you mentioned the hopping.
Yeah, I've had hopping off and on.
Or did she step like a backwards?
Yeah.
I mean,
I think it was one thing I had. I mean, it was just the most
Wow.
bizarre tick.
and you can see you're an experienced person, but you still see things where it's just, but it's all the same family and the kind of root cause.
I mean, if you ever looked at, I've seen lists, I call it the tick hit list, the list of all kinds of ticks that
Right.
people could have,
It
and
must be
it's just endless. I
It
mean, I could
could
never
be
make one up.
anything.
It could be absolutely anything to become a tick.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a whole new life.
Yeah, exactly.
So anything unusual. Well, okay, at least now I know what it is.
Well, it helps to know because then you know what you're dealing with, and
Right.
I think maybe it would help her to know that that's what it is. And
Do you have any, like, what do I tell? I just tell the brother, I mean, they're always smushed in the car together, so
Yeah.
he's always like, what are you doing? But, I can't, I guess I'll just tell him she can't help it.
just say it.
Just bring it in.
You can't help it. She can't help it. It's something she has to do as part of the job. End of issue, And I think once
Just
they
ignore it.
Yeah, just ignore it. And that's what you pretty much have to do.
Right.
You just ignore it.
Yeah,
Definitely.
wow.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, it's been incredible, and I just,
Oh,
I think
thank
that, the only thing that I can say is like, it's not life-threatening.
Yeah.
So,
I tell people all the time.
I mean, you
there
just have
could
to
be a
look at
whole
the good
lot worse.
signs.
Yeah.
I can't talk to other people that, that have kids or people with like very serious
Right,
things.
right.
And I'm like, well,
Yeah.
they're wondering like, what are you complaining
Yeah.
about?
Oh, yeah.
So that's the only thing we can do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you grow them up with just kind of try to normalize it as much as possible. They talk about other kids that might have it, professional or well-known people that might have it. I mean, I'm pretty sure that Mozart had to.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, what,
Yeah.
how do they,
All
what was
the all the
All
district
kinds of
presidents ever was always tons of tics and accommodations.
Oh, I didn't know.
Same thing with Samuel Johnson, who wrote the first English dictionary. Clearly,
So there's those, you can be a high functioning
Yeah.
person, I mean, it
so many
doesn't
kids quote.
disrupt
One
your.
of our kids is sitting up there now, he's a senior in college. And he's really struggling, you know? He's brilliant.
Oh my
Brilliant
God.
kid.
So I mean, but that's the thing, it's like I keep thinking about it, I came here, I wanted to learn more.
Right, well,
But
it's good
there's-
you did, because you're learning a lot more.
Now I can go tell other folks. But thank you so much,
You're
really
welcome,
appreciate it.
thank you. Is anybody still out there? Are still people out there? That's all right. I think we're going to get started again because I want to make sure I have enough time for these kids on the panel later. So anyway, people will just have to dribble in. We talked about the associated disorders. I'm going to start with the OCD. First of all, I think the OCD, to me, and this is my own personal opinion, is probably the most closely related to the Tourette. You know, and for a lot of reasons. I have always called my OCD tics in my brain. My body tics, my brain tics. I get stuck on something and I can't move on from it. And that's pretty much what a tic is. You know, my head will shake back and forth. I get something that my mind is stuck on and I can't let that go. And I think that the other things that, you know, one of the biggest problems with OCD is the tics for the most part you can see, but the OCD is happening inside your head. And if you're not telling people about it and what you're obsessing about, then how do they know you're doing it? And so they cannot, you know, there are some really big red flags for OCD if you know what you're looking for. But oftentimes they look more behavioral than they do OCD, and because it's not as obvious. The other thing is the OCD is waxes and wanes just like the tics do. The OCD symptoms change. They get worse when you're stressed. They get worse when you're excited. You know, it's got a lot of the same features as what the tics do. You know, the problem is that with OCD, kids are reluctant many times to disclose their troublesome thoughts for fear that other people will think they're crazy, so they don't talk about it. And I know most of my life that's exactly what I did. You know, I wouldn't tell anyone that I was counting words as I was reading and all these crazy things that I was doing because I was afraid that people would think I was nuts, because I felt nuts most of the time. So it really makes it difficult. And you know, the obsession is kind of that intrusive or recurring thought, image, or impulse that your mind is stuck on, and it's unpleasant and disrupts functioning. Although sometimes I run into people all the time who claim, you know, to the end of their life that it does not disrupt their functioning. However, sometimes they're not thinking of the rest of the people in their family, how it's disrupting their functioning. And I know I was a lot in denial myself over the years with the OCD, but there were things, you know, that did disrupt my functioning. Whereas the compulsion is what you had to do to alleviate the anxiety that accompanies that obsession. You know, one of the biggies that we hear about, you know, all the time, and some people kind of equate that to OCD, is obsession with germs or contamination. And if you have an obsession with germs and contamination, then obviously the compulsion is going to be to wash. You're going to wash your hands, you know, you're going to wash things in your house. We have a lady who comes to our support group quite frequently. She's an older woman, and she tells me all the time that every week she washes all our light bulbs. Like, whoa, I don't think I've ever washed a light bulb. You know, I wait till it burns out and I throw it away and we start over. But she has to every week go around and take the light bulbs out and dust them. So, you know, that's the obsession, is that for fear the dust is gathering and it's going to, you know, cause some disease or something, and then she has to go around and do this. So it's so much like, you know, like the tics, but it's just happening in your brain instead. Now, you know, I made up a list of common obsessions and compulsions. I have to tell you, when I first wrote this list, it was about 4 pages long, but I realized I was obsessing a little too much on my list of obsessions. So I decided to break it down. And I mean, honestly, anything can become an obsession. You know, I've never had germ obsessions. People think that it's cleanliness. No, it's not always that. And probably less than it's cleanliness when you have the Tourette along with it. However, you know, in my life, and with a lot of kids, it's symmetry, perfectionism, neatness. If anybody saw the little girl, Hazel, who was helping me set up the lunch, I mean, everything had to be perfectly in line and perfectly set up, and every stack had to be, restacked until it was exactly perfect. And I said to her, I said, looks like a little OCD, honey. She goes, oh, I don't have OCD. Okay, sorry I brought it up, But, there are a lot of times red flags for it, but we miss them. Now, a red flag for symmetry could be something as simple as somebody writing and erasing. I mean, every teacher in the world has seen a kid writing and erasing. I mean, it's not that uncommon, and erasing and writing and rewriting and erasing until the point where they've worn holes in their paper. And if you ask them why they're doing that, they will say to you, well, it didn't look like it was right on the line, or it didn't look like that F matched the F on the line before it. And so they have to keep erasing it. My first reaction when I see this is get the paper away from them. Let's start using 2018 technology where we can do things on a tablet or on a computer. And, with younger kids, you can get them a scribe because they can't stop doing it. And not only does it take them endless hours to get their work done, but what happens is it creates such a level of frustration of not being able to get their work done. And then if they got a hole in the paper, then you can't use that paper because it's got a hole in it. So now you got to start all over again on another sheet of paper, and to the point where oftentimes it could result in a meltdown. If I look around the kids that I work with that have the meltdowns, the rage, whatever you want to call it, I would say the number one reason in most of the kids that I work with is the OCD. They're stuck and you're trying to move them on. Transitions are difficult from them. They have to count things, and if you interrupt that counting, they got to start all over again. I worked with a girl 2 years ago who she would pick up anything that she had to read, whether it was a chapter in her science book or a novel for English. She would read 3 words, and then she had to stop, and in her head she had to say them 3 more times till they sounded just right. Then she would close the book cover, and she would tap 3 times at the cover of the book. Then she would open it up, and then she'd read 3 more words, say it 3 times in her head until it felt just right. Close the book, tap. Now, what are you going to get done when that's happening every 3 words? And it was getting to the point where she was not getting her work done. Her grades were dropping from A's and B's to C's and D's, and she wasn't telling anybody about it. And so I talked with her at length at one of our kids groups one time, and she said, it's so weird, I don't like to talk about it. My response when a kid says that to me is, I got a lot of years on you, honey. I can out-weird any OCD that you've had, believe me. And I'll tell them about one OCD trait that I've had throughout my life that is particularly weird. And she opened up to me what she was doing. And I said, how about if we tell your teachers, because I've got some thoughts of how we could help you with this. She was reluctant, but she did come to the meeting, and her mom came, and we talked about it and told the teachers. And I had the solution already. But fortunately, the school psychologist came up with the idea and said, how about if we put everything that she has to read on tape? And I said, yeah, that was going to be my suggestion. We could download textbooks onto the computer, and then she doesn't have to read them, she just has to listen to them. And when she was listening without having to read the words, it didn't happen. And that's how we got her through the next couple of years until that obsession started subsiding. So again, it's trying to think outside the box. What's the problem here? What can we do to alleviate her having to read? And we were able to do it fairly easily, and her grades started going back up again. Sometimes checking things can be, I think everybody checks, before you go out of your house in the morning, the stove is turned off and things are unplugged and the coffee pot's unplugged, and sometimes you check to make sure the heat is turned down a few times. And I think everybody does that, but I think it's when you can't stop doing it, when you have to keep going back and keep going back and keep going back. I always call it the you never know disease. You never know. You think you did it, but you never are quite sure. You just aren't quite sure, so you have to keep going back and going back and going back. I will be honest with you, before I was medicated for OCD, I would get ready to go to teaching in the morning, to school in the morning. I'd have my book bag in my hand, my car keys in my hand. I would set them by the front door, and I had to allow 45 minutes to get out of my house. That's how debilitating it was. That was what I had to allow. First, the blinds and the 2 front windows had to be perfectly symmetrical. I would, straighten and straighten and straighten and straighten. And there were days when I would drive out of my garage across the front of my house, and they still didn't look right, even though I'd spent 10 minutes on them. I mean, what if the blind inspectors come during the day and find out how I really live? I have to get these blinds straight. Then it was measuring the bedspread with a yardstick on all 3 sides of my bed. You know, it was just the continual checking, and then checking and symmetry and organizing and making sure things on pillows on the couch were straight. And I think, you know, when the first medication that came out that was fairly successful for OCD was Prozac, and the doctor recommended it, but I had been on some really tough medications because I was, you know, diagnosed quite a few years ago. The only thing they had to offer me at that time was Haldol. That was a lovely year in my life, taking Haldol. So I was really, you know, I was definitely calling off, you know, all medications. But the doctor tried to talk me into it, and I think the one thing that pushed me over the edge is to add to my list of checking and symmetry with the blinds, and symmetry with the bedspread, and symmetry with the pillows on the couch. One day I got obsessed with checking to make sure that the milk carton in my refrigerator was perfectly lined up in the corner of the shelf. Had to be perfect. And you know, you'd go back and you check it, and then you close the door, and you think, that door closes kind of hard. So, you know, it could have jarred, so I better open it up and check again. One day I was there at my refrigerator for the 9th time. I mean, I'm thinking, you're not going to get to work today, lady. You got to do something. And so the only thing that I could think of to do is I took the milk to work with me. I had no choice. It's like, okay, milk, we're going to work, you know. I stopped at Dunkin' Donuts, got donut holes for my homeroom, and we had milk, and I had some paper cups, and they thought I was just a nice teacher. I had no idea that it was to get out of my house. I had to do that. And I think sometimes then you know that it's so interfering that you have to do this. And I did go on Prozac, and I've done very well on it since that time. Transitions are very, very difficult for kids. You know, suddenly telling them to switch from activity A to activity B with no transition warning. They just can't, you know. I used to have, you know, at the end of a class, if kids weren't finished something, I could immediately tell the OCD kids, because they just, like, I'm not quite finished, and I can't leave it, and I got to finish it before I leave. And so I developed in the corner of my classroom on the shelf, I had a basket that I called the to finish later basket. And what they would do is, if they weren't quite finished and were going into a meltdown over not being able to finish their work, I'd have them put it in the to finish later basket. But the one component that I missed at first, and then it took me about a week to figure it out, is in order to really make it work for them, is I had to put a sign-in sheet, and they would write down the day and the time they were going to actually come in and finish it. And then, okay, like, I'm going to come in tomorrow during my lunchtime, sit in the back of the classroom and finish this assignment. And then you could get them to let it go. You know, that's our new theme song, let it go. And sometimes it's, you know, as simple as that. It's just kind of thinking about what you can do to get that kid to move on. I started, you know, many years ago in my teaching career, giving transition warnings to the whole class. You know, even if they don't have OCD, it's not going to kill them. If I say in 4 minutes we're going to move on, in 3 minutes we're going to move on. I always say it's like going to the football game. You know, it's a 2-minute warning, and we have to get ourselves prepared for that. Ritualistic behavior. Sometimes kids who have to go through certain rituals. Here's a ritual I had when I moved from my one-room schoolhouse. My mother put me in a parochial school, and I had never been in a parochial school. And the nun, the first day of school, said to us that, and I was unaware of this fact, and she said that you know that whenever you walk by a Catholic church, you have to make the sign of the cross. And I remember saying to her, well, why? And she answered, well, because that's what you have to do, and if you don't, there's just no salvation. It will be hell. There's no other salvation. What she didn't know is my house was next door to a Catholic church. So to go from my living room to my dining room, I had to cross in front of a church. So for a good year, it was insanity. I had to do that, or I was going to hell. And I was so angry at my family because they wouldn't do it. So I thought that I'll be in heaven, but they'll all be in hell. So we'll never see them again. I mean, this is the kind of, you know, torture you put yourself through. The anxiety piece, and I love that, you know, we were talking about that earlier. There's OCD type anxiety, there's generalized anxiety, there's social anxiety. It's one of the most difficult things I work with in schools with kids. I'm probably across the state now working with probably about 8 or 9 kids who are just not in school. You know, we have a really good counseling program in Buffalo, run by Dr. Diegelman, and he works with me to set up a gradual return. Like sometimes you just have to take them out because they can't get into the parking lot. They start throwing up the minute the mother drives up to drop them off. And so we take them out, put them on home instruction, and very gradually reduce school back to them with supports in place. And I mean, it's debilitating, and a lot of people just don't get it. They think that it's just the kid trying to get out of school. I had a family last year. Because of this, they were turned into Child Protective Services for educational neglect, and spent a whole year fighting Child Protective Services. Really, I mean, not that you've got enough to deal with your 2 children having Tourette, but now we've got to manipulate that system. And I think the one that in my book I actually coined this last one, and I've had it my whole life, and I've seen it with, I can't even tell you how many dozens of kids that I've worked with. It's what I call an obsessive sense of justice. Dawn's just shaking her head. These are the kids in a classroom. If you give them back a test and they think they should have had a 95.5 and you only gave them a 95, they are at your desk within 3 seconds. They will argue with you until the day is long about that grade. If you tell them that on Friday we're all going for pizza, Friday there's a blizzard and it would be dangerous for the family to go for pizza, they can't move on from it. It's like it's not fair. You said we were going for pizza. I don't care if it's snowing. My mother called me one time and she said, my son got on the bus this morning and he asked me what was for dinner, and I said, I'm going to make barbecue chicken. And he said, oh great, can we have french fries with that? And she said, sure. He went off to school. She went off to work. She's a nurse. She got home about 3:30 and totally forgot that conversation. And when she said that to me, I went, this isn't going to end well. Okay. And she had made, I don't even know what she made, meatloaf or spaghetti or something he liked, but he came home and the whole day his obsessive brain was thinking of barbecue chicken and french fries, barbecue chicken and french fries. And she changed the plan, and that wasn't fair. And he had a meltdown where we had curtains coming out the bedroom window. And you think to yourself, come on, really? Isn't that a little bit of an overreaction? But in his head, that was not fair because that's not what she had said. His teacher the same year, he was a 4th grader, said to me, he said, this is what I get every single day. He said, we have a rule in class that at 10:30 we have snack time. I said, okay. And he said, so every day, he said, like, here's today. He said, today I am correcting their math homework and I have one problem left. I look at the clock and it says 10:30. So I go, well, I'm going to finish that problem. No, you're not. Kid raises his hand. It's 10:30 and we have snack at 10:30. Because just one more math problem, we'll have snack. But you don't understand. You said at 10:30. You said it. It's written right there on the chart that at 10:30, he could not let it go. Until the point where he was in tears at 10:32. So the teacher said to me, what do I do? And I said, well, you're going to change your rule. That's what you're going to do. And the rule is now going to say, every day when math class finishes, we have snack. I mean, it's as simple as that, I have a brother who has 2 boys with significant OCD, and he doesn't say yes, he doesn't say no. It's always maybe, we'll see, we're not sure, And like this mother said to me, what do I do when I have to change the dinner menu? I said, well, the first thing you did wrong is tell them what's for dinner. You don't tell them in the first place. Sometimes it's as simple as that. Sometimes it's more complicated. The obsessive sense of justice is really, really difficult. If they see something in the classroom that you didn't see, they're the first ones that are going to come up and tell you that. I used to always, when I would be out sick, on a sick day at school, the minute I came in my classroom, you knew right away who the OCD kids were. Do you know what that sub did? I go, what did that sub do? You know how you keep your stapler here? Well, she put it over there. And I'm like, well, let's get that right back where it belongs. Just that things have to be the way they're used to them being. So, I mean, you can see how OCD is so difficult. And then, I'm not going to go into these because they're obviously less common obsessions. Hoarding, we've all seen the hoarding show. I have a cousin who is a hoarder. Collecting things, a lot of these kids have to collect and collect until they get the last. Years ago when Masters of the Universe was a really big thing, my nephew, who is now 40, turned 40 this year, collected them. And he had every one of every collection. And to this day, he still has them in his attic in their original boxes, hoping that even though he had a daughter, someday she might be interested. Okay, but that was his obsession. What we used to call kleptomania. I've worked with a number of kids who have compulsive stealing, obsessive fears, very irrational fears, that you're afraid of if you don't, the old step on the crack, you break your mother's back kind of thing. Unwanted sexual thoughts that go through your head over and over and over again. It can be very disturbing. Unwanted violent thoughts. Religious obsessions, that was my sign of the cross. That was what they now call scrupulosity. And it was just ridiculous. I spent a whole year doing that. A lot of times when I hear somebody say, I'm very superstitious, that kind of has a ring of OCD to it. So, it's just such a complicated disorder, and there's so many manifestations of it. And you never really know from minute to minute. And, just some examples, an obsession with erasing words, because they don't look perfect, get writing accommodations for them. I had a girl who, when she bubbled, had a test where you had to bubble. It had to be right inside that bubble. It had to be absolutely perfect. Couldn't have a stray mark outside. And she would take the test and spend 2 hours bubbling, to the point it's like, please take that sheet away from her. Somebody bubble it for her. The counting compulsion, again, books on tape. Many students with OCD need an accommodation of time limits waived, because it causes stress. The OCD gets worse. And I think probably your most important feature of dealing with a child with OCD is being creative. It's like there is no box for these children. You must think outside the box. And I've had many examples over the years of, dealing with kids and having to come up with some very unusual accommodation for them. I mean, it's a neurological disorder. They're driven. They're perfectionistic. There's a need to complete. They're difficulty transitioning. Their mental brakes are stuck. They're stuck. They can't move on from it. They want to stop. They can't. As much as they want to stop ticking and they want to stop obsessing, they can't. And I think sometimes just figuring out, if you can recognize it, one of the things that really helps with OCD is humor. And you can tell by my presentation style that the only reason I am where I am today is because I have humor. If I didn't have humor, I would not be here, because it was tough. And I see that with a lot of kids. If they can develop that sense of humor, it really makes a difference. This is the doctor I was just telling you about from Buffalo who does our program. I was his advocate many years ago when he was in school. Second most common thing is, probably second most common, the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which a lot of people know more about that, but it creates havoc in the classroom. But I think before I do, if you've done this exercise before, you can skip it. If you haven't done it, I'm going to ask you to kind of do it along with me. One of the things that I think parents and kids struggle with is figuring out what it feels like to have this disorder. How does it feel? How does it disrupt your life? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little test to do. So you have to have something to write on and something to write with. Does everybody have a little something they can write on and write with? It could be a scrap of paper or whatever. I started doing this probably 25 years ago, and it's now built into the Youth Ambassador program. They do it all the time. And it's one of the most effective ways that I can illustrate to teachers what it's like to have this disorder. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a test. Okay, you didn't expect a test today, but this is what we call a pop quiz. And I'm going to give you something to write, and while you're writing it, you're going to have Tourette syndrome. Now, what you're going to have to write is something that almost everybody in this room will probably know. Well, maybe Gary, I don't know. Do you know the pledge to the flag? He's got it. It's the pledge to the flag. Everybody knows it. We grew up in school saying it every single day of our lives. Okay. So when I say go, you're going to have to write the pledge to the flag. However, you have Tourette. So every time I hit the microphone to the table, you're going to do the tick I talked about earlier. You're going to take your little finger and you're going to hit it on the page. So every time I hit the microphone to the table, take your little finger. By the way, you must tick with the hand you're writing with. I see people already planning to tick with the other one, yeah. And you're going to hit it on the page, okay? You also, are people starting and I didn't say go? The second thing is you have a little bit of OCD. So every third word that you write doesn't look like it's right on the line, so you're going to cross it all out and then you're going to rewrite it. So every time I clap my hands, hit your little finger to the page, every third word, cross out and rewrite. This is a time test, by the way. So when I say go, we're going to have 70 seconds to do this. Very easy to do this in 70 seconds, okay? Everybody ready to get started? Oh, neatness is very important, don't forget. And also, Parents' Night's coming up, and I'm going to hang these up for your parents so they can see how well you know the pledge to the flag by giving you enough stressors. All right, you may begin. Don't forget, every time I hit that microphone, hit your little finger. Don't forget, every third word must be crossed out and rewritten, if you've gotten to the third word. You've used a good portion of your time, so I hope you're making some good progress. Don't forget neatness and Parents' Night that's coming up. Remember, as stress increases, tics get worse. You're down to about 20 seconds. Don't forget every third word to cross it out. 5 seconds. Time is up. How many finished? No one. No one ever finishes. How did you feel while you were doing this? Yeah. I hear a lot of times frustrated, angry. How many of you stopped doing it? Yeah. Don, I saw you stop and you stopped right away. And why did you stop?
I was just too frustrated.
Yeah, too frustrating. And also you knew you weren't going to finish it anyway. So what's the point? Why even keep up with it? And to be honest with you, did I really give you Tourette? I gave you one tic and one obsession. That's not even a diagnosis. That's all I gave you. And imagine if you are somebody like, doing this and all the million tics that are going on and blinking your eyes, and all of this is happening at the same time, and you feel horrible. How many of you feel that this is an accurate evaluation of how well you know the pledge to the flag? Yeah. What would your grade have been? Yeah, exactly. And and not only that, does it look like the neatest piece of work you've ever done? Because you've crossed out and you've rewritten and you've crossed out and you've rewritten. And you think about this and you think of how these kids go through their day. One tic and one obsession, and this is how you feel. It's just over and over and over. You have to keep doing something. And imagine at the same time you have to count the number of words, or at the same time you have to, you have some ADHD, so every little noise is distracting you as you're looking around. I gave you one tic and one obsession, and you couldn't do something that you could easily do. And I think we wonder sometimes why these kids give up, and we wonder sometimes why these kids have meltdowns. I think this is the perfect example. The perfect example. And, I didn't want to frustrate you in the middle of our workshop, but I really feel strongly that people have to understand exactly, what it feels like to have this disorder. And what's a perfect way to give this kid this test and get an accurate evaluation of how well they know it? Type it. Scribe it to someone. Voice-activated software, talk it into a computer. I mean, there's so many different ways you can do it, and we make them write it, and we keep them to that, and they can't get through it. And then how do they feel on Parents' Night when everybody else has got 100 or a 98, and they've got, an F, on their paper, and it's hanging up on the wall. They feel horrible about themselves. I had a little kid recently, he's a 7th grader from camp, and he said to me, I know I'm not smart. And I said, well, why do you think you're not smart? I said, I think you're a very smart kid. He said, because so many other people can take notes and listen at the same time and can copy things from the board correctly. And he started naming all of these things that have absolutely nothing to do with intelligence. But to him, that meant he wasn't very smart. And so many of those things are so easily accommodated in a classroom, especially in the day and age that we're in now, but you've got to understand how they interfere before you start accommodating them. The ADHD I'll go through quickly because we don't have a lot of time. This is probably my favorite slide in my whole collection. This is my portrait of a hyperactive child. Do you see them? We give them a chair, but they're rarely on that chair. They're under the chair and over the chair and walking around the back of the classroom. I mean, they can't sit still. And it's so difficult. I was in a school recently in a town outside of Buffalo called Lockport, New York, and every classroom in the building has a desk. It's kind of high, and the base of the desk is like a stationary bicycle. I loved it. So all these kids are sitting at their desk, and when the hyperactive kids couldn't sit still anymore, they're pedaling their little feet away and, getting that exercise that they needed. But these kids just can't sit still and stay where they are. It's a disorder, hyperactivity is a neurological disorder, very often associated with Tourette. Could be the most problematic because it's interpreted many, many times as a behavior problem, as we know. And the characteristics that you see with the ADHD are pretty much 5 of the same things. They're inattentive, really difficulty focusing on tasks for any length of time, very, very impulsive, never think before they act, hyperactive, can't sit still, they're in movement all the time. We've all had kids in our class who are tappers, or they have to tap their feet. When I had a kid who had to tap, I would just put a sponge on their desk and let them tap on that. Yeah, I would say to them, if you got to tap your foot, just take your shoe off. Find a way they can get that movement without disrupting everybody else. I think one of the major issues with with ADHD is the disorganization, which we now call executive dysfunction. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Very disorganized, don't remember to turn things in, do their homework, leave it on their desk, do their homework, it's in the bottom of their backpack, or they're sitting in class and it's in their folder and they never turn it in when the teacher collects it because they're distracted. If you go to school and you don't turn your homework in, you're not going to do very well at school. And it kind of looks many times like they just don't care. They just don't care about school. They're not trying. We hear that many, many times. They're just hopelessly disorganized. I see it all over my family. I see it with so many of the kids I work with. My goal is for every kid that I work with across this chapter to make them paperless. Okay? In this day and age, we can do that. And I've got a lot of kids that are. Everything is done on a computer because of their handwriting problems. Everything, they use their computer to set up their calendar so they can keep track of things. They can set timers on their computer to remind them of things. I have a list a mile long, and I have an entire list of free apps. I'm really good at finding free apps, okay, that work for just about any of these issues that you have. I'm going to go through this quickly because we're running out of time. I also like this slide here, but by the time I think about it, I've already done it. That's your typical ADHD child. And, the executive dysfunction it's really huge with these kids. Psst, Mom, I just remembered that I have to build a diagram of the solar system by second period tomorrow. How many have heard that one before? They just don't remember, and it's the middle of the night, and you're expected to get up and run up to Walmart to pick up the supplies they need to make their diorama, and they've had the assignment for 3 weeks. But I've told teachers 100 times, if I've told them once, if you give a kid a long-range assignment who has this disorder, and you say this is due in 3 weeks, you might as well say to them, honey, get this into me before you die. That is what it means to them. They have no clue what 3 weeks means. You have to say, it's due in 3 weeks now, let me take that away from you, and we're going to break yours down. In 3 days, this is what you're going to do. And then we're going to take that away, and we're going to give you a 2-day break. And then 2 days later, we're going to give you this. You can chunk things. You can break it down for them. There are so many ways you can do it. This little girl is a girl out of the Syracuse area who, she had gym at the end of the day. And this was the locker room after she ran out to her car to meet her mom who was waiting for her. And she came to the car in her gym clothes and nothing in her hand. And her mother...
I think I was probably her camp counselor. This looks familiar.
Yes, yeah. And her mother says, where's all your stuff? She goes, what do you mean my stuff? She said, your like book bag or backpack and your clothes that you came to school in and your other shoes and your homework. And she's listing all the things, and they walk back in, and there it is. She just walked out of that gym in her gym clothes. Yeah. It's ridiculous. I used to, when kids would forget to bring a pen or pencil to class. Now, there are 3 reasons why kids don't bring a pen or pencil to class. Number 1, their pen runs out of ink, and that happens, so you lend them a pen. Number 2, they had 3 pencils, but somebody tripped them in the hallway on the way to class and they lost them. Number 3, they have ADHD. So either way, lend them a pen or a pencil. It's not worth losing sleep over a pen or pencil. I'm not going to take points off your test. I'm not going to, and I used to always, for many, many years I did this up till I retired. When I lent them a pencil to make sure I got it back, I would let them leave a shoe by my desk. And then usually, but not 100%, they would remember to give me the pencil back because they would notice halfway down the hall they were missing a shoe. So, just find ways and don't constantly be blaming them for it. These are kids who don't keep track of their belongings, they don't organize their materials, they have trouble getting started on a task, breaking down assignments, sequencing information, forming goals. Where do they write down their homework assignments? It's not been known to happen very often. They usually don't. Or they write it on the back of their hand and they wash their hand. Or, I've got kids all over the state taking pictures of their homework assignments on the board with their cell phone. There's just a million ways. One little boy calls his home answering machine every day at the end of the day. His guidance counselor lets him come down and he calls the home answering machine and he leaves himself messages. When he comes home, he said, oh, look, I've got messages. And it's his homework assignment. Whatever works for them. They have trouble managing their time. Working memory can be difficult for them. Performing to their potential, obviously. They lose their homework and other materials. They come to class unprepared, disorganized. I walked into a Buffalo City Honors School about 6 years ago, and it was a 6th grade class. And I walked in and I said, I bet anything I could tell you which desk was Joey's. And the teacher said, you could not. And I said, yeah, I could. And I walked right over to it. Because every other desk closed, one of those top things that comes down, except for one where everything was falling out all over, out of the top of that desk. And next to the desk, all around the desk, were stacks of paper. So sure I knew which desk was this right away. They don't finish anything, difficulty, managing workload. And I think one of the biggest things that I see with kids is they become instantly overwhelmed. Here's 5 problems to do for math homework. Oh my God, I'll never get this done. Oh my God, I'll never. To them, it is so overwhelming. I mean, it could be 5 problems and they're overwhelmed. So, box things off, if you break things down, they don't become overwhelmed. One kid said to me one time, he said, when I have 3 assignments in 3 different classes and I get home, it's like the teacher saying to me, he said, it's like me going into a doctor's office and how they have these file cabinets and rows and rows and rows and rows and rows of files. And there's an earthquake and all the files come out of the folders and fall to the ground. And they tell me I have a half hour to get everything back on the files. I mean, think of that compared to I have 3 homework assignments tonight, But that's how overwhelmed they get with it. So again, what is overwhelmed? What does that create? A meltdown. That's exactly what happens. I'm going to skip on. I love this. Is one of my favorite slides for ADHD. We've all seen this locker, okay? I have a nephew who never had a locker in all 4 years of high school. He said there's no sense because I'd never find anything in it anyway. So they assigned him one. He just carried everything around in his book bag that weighed about 900 pounds. Social immaturity is very, very common with these kids, and sometimes it's, Dr. Ross Green has this theory, and it's true in just about every case of kids who have this disorder, that you take their chronological age, and if you take 2/3 of it, socially and emotionally, that's about where they are. So if your child is 15 and you take 2/3 of that, you're going to get 10. And the older they get, the more discrepancy there is. If you're 6 acting 3 or 4, yeah, a little noticeable. But if you're 15 acting 10, it gets more obvious. And socially and emotionally, that's where they are. And how do you speed that up? You can't. You really can't. And so there's, a lot of social issues. I love this when ADHD is managed by the moment. I'm not going to read through all those, but I have a list of ADHD accommodations assisting, with managing the workload. You can get these right on the IEP. Creative methods of keeping track of assignments. I'm having trouble reading this. Teachers signing assignment book. I'm going to have to read it from my computer. Emailing homework assignments home. Doing your homework and emailing it into the teacher. I mean, that's such a simple thing. That's what they do in college now. You email everything in. And that way you don't lose it somewhere between home and school. My nephew to this day calls the trip between home and school, and he's now in his 30s, the black hole. Because everything somehow got lost in that black hole. You know, there are just so many different things, leaving messages on voicemail, extra books at home so they don't have to remember what they have to bring home every night. You know, I could go on and on and on, and I'm going to just skip quickly to the next slide. I mean, this is all going to come home to you, so you'll have this list of things. And I think one of the most important things is what we accomplished back in 2004 and was actually put into law in 2007. It was put in the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. I was very involved in this. I was the education specialist for the National Association at the time, and I actually went to the White House, testified in Congress, just really worked hard, and we finally were able, after many, many years of trying, to get Tourette officially listed in the federal education law as a disability, and it states that we believe Tourette syndrome is commonly misunderstood as a behavioral disorder or an emotional condition rather than a neurological condition, therefore including Tourette in the definition of other health impaired, or OHI, may help correct the misconception of Tourette as a behavioral or conduct disorder and prevent the misdiagnosis of their needs. I mean, I can tell you, I was doing this long before that became a law, and the difference that it has made has been huge. I mean, just about every kid I worked with, they wanted to classify them emotionally disturbed because that's how they looked at it. And the only other diagnosis you could get was LD, learning disabled, and you only got that if you could actually have a discrepancy between verbal and performance IQ. And some of our kids don't fit that. They don't. And so they would say, well, if he wants an IEP, we've got to do it emotionally disturbed. And so many times the IEP classification, drives the program and drives the accommodations and everything else. It's not supposed to, but it does. So we're really excited about that, and it's really been helpful. I'm going to talk very quickly about the learning disabilities. Very, very common to have them. They contribute to poor school performance, low self-esteem. Any learning disability could be present. Certainly always have an assessment by the school psychologist and evaluation. Unfortunately, with a lot of our kids, their disabilities tend to fall in the nonverbal areas. And we're talking, number one, about handwriting issues, dysgraphia. I can't tell you how few kids I work with that don't have dysgraphia. I mean, it's such a common disorder. And it's, slow and laborious writing, hand and finger cramping. It hurts to write. You can write 2 or 3 words, and I have it, and I've always had it, and you have to shake your hand out because it really, really hurts to write. And after you write a few, because it hurts so much to write and your fine motor skills are so weak, you have sloppy, messy handwriting that's all over the page, uneven spacing. I do irregular margins all the time. Margins always go sideways when I try to write anything. Inconsistent lettering. Sometimes you copy things wrong. You'll copy the assignment from the board will say page 10, 1 through 20. You'll write down page 21 through 10. There's a visual motor component. You copy it down wrong. And of course you do the wrong assignment, A lot of our kids have difficulty with letter reversals, and not just like a D to a B, but reversals within a word. To this day, I still reverse vowels and just about every word I write. I can see it when I look at it because I'm not dyslexic, but I'm dysgraphic. And so when I look at it, I go, I knew how to spell read. I know it was R-A-E-D or R-E-A-D. Why did I type R-A-E-D? I do it when I type and when I write. But I see it, and then thank God we have spell check, and we corrected it. I don't look like the ignorant person that I would look like if I said it out the way it was. So I think there's so many different things, and the thing is, with a lot of kids have difficulty with punctuation and capitalization. They'll write and they don't put the right punctuation marks, even though they know they should go there. They have difficulty getting, what we call a difficulty of written expression, getting the thoughts from here to their paper. They'll write a sentence, and the first sentence they write is more like, should be the conclusion sentence rather than the beginning sentence. The thoughts are all over the place. I have several apps that are listed on my entire PowerPoint that are, what we call, I won't be able to think of the name of it, graphic organizers. And most of the time when they use graphic organizers in school, they hand them a piece of paper. But now we've got the visual motor component. There are probably 20 apps that have graphic organizers right on the computer. And they're all free, and they go by age level. And it really, they really do work for kids. This is, one of the things I've been collecting over the years is samples of kids' work. These are all kids that I've worked with over the years. If you want to know what dysgraphia looks like, if you looked at it and did not pick up a dysgraphia as an educator, this is so classic. And he added another component to it. Can anybody see what the other component is? OCD. He has to go over letters and over letters and over letters. Not every word, but some words. If it doesn't look quite right, he has to cross it out. He has trouble with the spacing, so he draws his own lines, but oftentimes they're crooked. And this was the first page of the assignment. And then you see, as we get down toward the bottom of the page, it gets worse and worse because you no longer you can do the handwriting because it's too hard to write with your, fine motor skills. And it's all over the page and the writing gets bigger. I asked this kid, his name is Thomas, and I asked him how long it took him to do this 2-page assignment, and he said probably about 2 hours. I could see that looking at it. He said a lot of it was just going over things and crossing things out, but a lot of it was having to stop because my hand hurt too much. So when you add the tic component, like what if you got this tic where you're cleaning your, all of that going along with the dysgraphia. This one I love. This is a classic. This is a paragraph that's all one word. It's just, there is no space, nothing there. It's just they don't see that they have to space between words. Their letters are huge. This is a kid in a school in central New York, and they will not let him use a computer. So we're struggling along. There's so many things you can do about dysgraphia. You can use technology. I'm going to skip through the slides about, some of the things you can do because you're going to get this. I've got, one of the things you can do is, and we'll talk about this for people coming tomorrow, you can request an assistive technology evaluation, which explores the technology that would help these kids with whatever their problem is. And they do sometimes a really good job, and then you figure out what computer platform the school uses, and you can get in there and, the Chromebooks are very common, but a lot of schools still use the Mac products. And there's so many things we can do to help these kids that, we need to go through and get a lot of this stuff done. I always say the toolbox for assistive technology are, no matter what platform you use, voice to text is huge with these kids. Ezra, you're using it, right? And I know we've talked about it, and it really is working for him. He just talks into the tape recorder.
We have the hardest time finding consistent programming that works from year to year because the schools
Yes.
are always changing.
Yes.
And, we were 7 weeks in this year, and they still hadn't started a speech and text program for us. We were still scribing every day for hours. And, we finally just said, okay, so before our meeting tomorrow, this needs to be in place.
Right.
We want you to tell us if it's not, who this scribe is going to be in school.
Yeah.
And that they made it happen immediately. So it's inconsistent at best.
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah, and a lot of schools have changed computer platforms from Mac to Google. The one on Google is actually one of the best ones.
Yeah, ours is using Microsoft 365.
No.
So it's a little.
This is called Read and Write. It costs a little bit more, but it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. Doctors use it to take transcription. It's really a good one. The one that Max is the Dragon Dictation is also very excellent. But some schools are still using the Dragon Speak Naturally or something, which is, God, it's horrible. It's horrible. It misses every other word. It's really difficult to use. There's so many platforms now that are so much better than that. And I think really, you really have to work with them. And that's why an assistive tech eval, the tech person who evaluates them will tell you, this is what you need to do. And once it's coming from them, then oftentimes it forces the school into getting that program. It's not like we're talking millions of dollars here. It's not. But they just want to live. That the Dragon, what you were just talking about, that's like 20 years old. It's horrible. It just doesn't work. And then if you've got vocal tics, that kind of thing. But you can say, well, what happens if I'm dictating and I have curse words? And I go, that's what delete is for. You go back later and just make sure all those words are taken out. Graphic organizers, text to speech. There's so many different things. And like I said, I wish I had more time, but I've got suggested apps. This has got tons of information in it. One of the other things we see frequently with our kids is auditory processing disorder. That's fairly common with our kids, where they have difficulty, not attention-wise, but they have difficulty processing information at the same speed as everyone else. And I recognize it right away because you give them a direction and there's a hesitation. There's like a 10-second delay before they respond. And if with ADHD, they just wouldn't hear you. Whereas the auditory processing, you'll say, don't forget when you go to the bathroom to take that pass, and the kid will stand by the door and like, oh yeah, take the pass. Now, that's one direction. So you can imagine if you say to them, before before we get going today, I want you to take out your science books, open to page 3, and we're going to be on number 20C. I mean, they've lost you at take out your science books. And everything else, there's a delay, so they can't keep up with that. Huge, huge, huge issues. Lots of ways you can work with that. We've already talked about the social skills deficits. Sensory processing, very common in autism, extremely common with Tourette. And it's probably the second reason that I see kids have meltdowns. The kid I was with yesterday, the teachers filled out the sheet that I gave them. Where does he have his most difficult time? In the hallways between classes, in the cafeteria, on the school bus. They're on sensory overload. Smells bother them and tactile bothers them. I had a kid, here's a perfect example, one of my own students, I was following him down the hall, and it's a crowded middle school hallway, and I saw somebody bump into him, like bump into his shoulder, and he turned around and he punched this kid so hard in the nose, it drew blood. And I'm like, oh my God, Stephen, why did you do that? And he said, he hit me first. Now, I watched the whole thing happen, and he bumped into him, but to a kid who has processing difficulty, it felt like he got hit. I always tell parents, it's like if you send your kid to school in something they're not comfortable wearing, if it's got a turtleneck and it's driving them crazy, if it's got seams in their socks or a tag in the back of their shirt, it's like sending them to school with the worst sunburn they've ever had and making them wear a wool sweater over it. That's what it feels like. And how kind of a mood are you going to be in by the middle of the day? It's like making somebody have you sit by a chalkboard, the old-fashioned chalkboard, while they stand there and scratch their nails over and over and over again.
I actually like that sound.
Oh my God. I mean, it just, after a while, it causes the meltdowns, and this is what happens. And the thing is, they can vacillate in the course of one day from being hypersensitive, so, tags bother them and socks bother them and things like that, to being hyposensitive. And the hyposensitive is more, I'm sorry, I went backward here. They appear sluggish. They have sometimes self-abusive behaviors where they pick at their skin, where they, have to feel a certain sensation, oftentimes pain, where they have to bite their nails, where they have to scratch themselves over and over again. And, they crave strong sensory input, like carrying heavy objects, like, being on a balancing swing or something. A lot of these kids do well with weighted blankets, weighted lap things. Really makes a big difference for a lot of them. This is why OTs really need to be involved in the education of these children. I think this is, all of this can cause great anxiety and definitely meltdowns. I love this. Dear teacher, my son will be late for school because there's a bump in his sock. Thank you. Yeah, it's like, that happens, yeah, very common. And again, what can you do? Get the OT involved, get the evaluations done, get the accommodations in place. I love this quote from Russell Barkley in the CHAD Educator's Manual. We must see the child as in trouble and not the cause of trouble. It is so easy to think they're causing trouble when they are the ones who are really struggling themselves. I'm going to skip a lot of this because just don't have time. I want to get the kids up here. One of the things that's on here is a functional behavioral assessment for kids on this spectrum of disorders that really, really works. And this is my mantra. It came from Dr. Ross Green. He was just in this area this week, I heard. He was here in Albany on Thursday. It is your explanation of a behavior that leads directly to how you respond to it. And this could not be more true than with kids with Tourette. Here's the perfect example. I mean, we have to figure it out. A kid I worked with in Wisconsin, I was on a consult out there, and I walked in the building, and the principal greeted me, and she said, I want you to meet Claire, our girl with Tourette. And the minute Claire walked in the principal's office, she yelled at her new tic, "Kill the principal!" Followed by, "Kill the effing principal!" And she only had to say it when she saw or heard the principal. It's the only time it happened. And I'm thinking, wow, I wish I'd known this before I came. This would have been good information to share with me. And I was really convinced that they were going to just try to get her out of school. This principal was so phenomenal. She wanted everybody to understand this girl because she was such a special kid and so bright and so talented. And, we spent the whole day educating the staff, educating the kids. It was just a really enormously long day, but we got through everything. And at the end, the principal said to me, she said, the only time it really gets to me, because it's, and she loves this principal, wonderful lady. She said her homeroom is next door to the main office. And every morning when I come on the intercom, as all elementary principals do, and say, good morning, boys and girls, we need to stand for the pledge to the flag. The minute she hears my voice, I have to hear loud and clear from the room next door, kill the principal! Kill the effing principal! She goes, it's such a harsh way to start my day. So I looked at her and I said, do you have to make the announcements in the morning? Could someone else do it? And she just looked at me like, I really should have thought of that, shouldn't I? I said, not necessarily. It's one of those things. The next day, she had her secretary making the announcements, and that was the last time she had to yell it out in the morning. Now, every time she'd see her in the hallway during the day, it would happen. But just such a crazy, crazy thing. And it was so simple to solve that one problem. I'm going to skip through to the end. I'm sorry. There's all kinds of behavioral assessment stuff, but we just don't have time. But I want to get to the end and show you the last couple of things, and then we're going to get the kids down here. Sorry. There's no way to do it faster. Yeah, it's all in my book. Some famous people. I love my platinum rule. What can we do for the child prior to the behavior, rather than what can we do to the child after the behavior? We react, and we don't preload and pre-plan. If we just, accommodate these kids and give them what we know they need, this is not going to happen. And it's so much a part of it for so many of these kids. This is our camp that we do every year in the Finger Lakes region, southern Finger Lakes of New York State. It's called Camp Tickapalooza. A kid years ago named it, and it's stuck with it. Some of the kids that are in that picture are here today. You'll see them. We do it every year for a 3-day weekend. This is Jeremy, who's sitting down here, and 3 little boys, including his son, at our camp. This is Jacob, who has just walked out of the room, who is here. He's going to be on the panel doing a youth ambassador presentation. To me, Tourette is alphabet soup. I mean, that's how I look at it. It's ADHD, it's SPD, it's anxiety, it's learning disabilities. I think if I could leave you with two kind of words of wisdom, having lived with this, for so much of my life and dealing with it on a family, basis, and with all the schools I've been in, message one, these kids have incredible strengths. But all we see is the disorder and the tics and the obsessions and all the things that drive us crazy, and we miss some really incredible kids. We really do. We miss them. I had a boy who emailed me or Facebooked me in May of this year. I started working with him when he was a 3rd grader, and he was a mess. I mean, there's no question things were not going well for Frank. And I stayed with him all the way through high school. He went to the University of Buffalo, and he came to our camp, came back as a camp counselor, and he sent me a Facebook message, and it was a picture of him getting his law degree. I know. I really cried. I started to cry. It's like, I wrote him a message back and said, Frankie, I didn't think we'd get you out of 3rd grade. And he thought that was great. He said, yeah, I was pretty worried myself. On a bad day, Tourette can feel like a battle between your brain and your body. You are so focused on your opponent that it can be hard to do things that on a good day would be very easy. And that's something to keep in mind. And I think the last thing is, if there's any advice I could give you, is keep your sense of humor. Whether you are a parent or a clinician or a person with Tourette, whatever you are, whatever, if you can't laugh about this, you're never going to survive it. I mean, I have had to develop that sense of humor because every single day I go out, police stop me because I'm hitting the windshield of my car, and they say, are you all right? Are you signaling for help? And my pat answer for many years now has been, no, that was a spider on my windshield. Oh well, they fall for it. I just don't always have time for a Tourette presentation. I really don't. So, and quite a few years ago now, when we had camp t-shirts done. We have them done every year. The kids were asked to come up with slogans, like the old top 10 Letterman list. And these are all written, except for one, they're all written by kids. And I'm going to read through their sense of humor. Number 10, Tourette ticks me off. Number 9, I can tick with the best of them. Number 8, my family went to Hawaii and all I got were these lousy ticks. You better hope these ticks aren't contagious. I just love that one. This is my favorite. Sometimes I feel like a tick, sometimes I don't. Pop, pop, tick, tick. Oh, what a relief it is. I do not obsess, I do not obsess, I do not obsess. We do tick and right. You know the KFC commercial, we do chicken right? Well, we do tick and right. And my tick in the world ticks with you, or at least watches for a while. And my all-time favorite, I do solemnly swear. I'll come back to that. This is my book. It's an Tourette OCD checklist. Practical lists of things you can do, and lots of humorous stories and whatever. I would like the kids to come down so we can get started. We're about 3 or 4 minutes late. But what you have to do as you come down is go out in the hallway and bring a chair, because they took all our chairs away. Thank you. You missed your picture, Jake. We can start bringing them across, and then there's actually one here already, but why don't you, instead of bringing it in front, why don't you bring it like here? We'll just line you up like that, however. There we go. We'll make a little circle. You can move them in closer. And that way we can share our microphone. Okay. Do we have too many chairs or not enough? There we go. Yeah, why don't you move that down a little, Skylar, in this direction?
Everybody just move down.
Yeah, just, there we go. I think we got them. Thank you very much. Okay, what I'm going to do, because some of you weren't here this morning, is have them all introduce themselves, tell you where they're from, you know, what area of the state they're from, and also what their age is, what grade they're in, just some basic information, and then we're going to open it up to some questions. I'm going to ask them and open it up to your questions. We'll start with you. Who are you, young man?
Oh my god.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I have some. I'm sorry. My name is Ezra Daly Griffin. I am 12, and I'm in 7th grade.
And where do you live?
It's about an hour south of Buffalo.
South Dayton, New York. Proud to say that. Okay, Skylar.
My name is Skylar. I'm 13 and I'm from New York.
Hi, I'm Ezra's sister. I'm Willow. I am 14 years old. I'm a freshman in high school, and I am from South Dayton.
I'm Mickey, I'm 17, I'm from Buffalo.
I'm Alex. I'm 14. I'm a freshman in high school and I'm from Ardsley.
I'm Jacob Baird. I'm 21 years old, and I'm a senior in Plattsburgh University.
You good? Excellent. I should pass them. I know, we should have two, but we don't. Pass the microphone. I don't know, it's supposed to work. I think what I would like to do is, I would like to, because I've kind of followed a lot of these kids through school and been into a lot of and kind of know the issues. Oh, that's something you drop something. Okay. Maybe I should take
Is there something I'm
What is happening all of a sudden?
What's going on with the
I don't know. Okay, well, we'll do the best we can. We'll just try to, just don't move it around much. I'm going to ask them to kind of tell, just maybe an experience they've had in school which was very difficult for them. maneuvering through, whether it was a difficult teacher or a difficult, some of the kids that were being difficult to them. And then after we go that round, I'm going to ask them about what has really helped in school, what has helped them get to where they are. Here's Jacob, who is a senior in college already, and I met him when he was about 7th grade. And, I always knew he was going to be there. I knew he was going to get there. But he went to a kind of a resistant school, shall we say. This is a school that told me if I wanted to educate the kids, I had to sit in the cafeteria at lunch and hand out flyers to the 7th graders. And I said, so they can make paper airplanes out them when they come out the door and throw them at me? So, no, that wasn't going to happen. Okay, who wants to start? Something that's been really difficult. Why don't you pass that down to Jake?
One of the things I experienced that was difficult was I went through a period of time, like right after I was diagnosed, for a few years where I didn't want anyone to know. My symptoms and my tics weren't as noticeable as some of the other people with Tourette syndrome. And so I really struggled with who to tell. And I didn't really want any of my friends to know. I didn't really want my teachers to know at first. And I spent a lot of time hiding it, and because I thought it would be something that everyone would focus on, and I thought it'd be something that would make me kind of like a topic of discussion. That's not what I wanted. But over the years, I became more and more comfortable with it, and I really found out that it wasn't a big deal. I remember I finally decided to tell some of my closer friends, and when I had that conversation, it really was, I was expecting it to be all anyone was going to talk about for a week, and I thought I'd have to answer all these uncomfortable questions I wasn't ready for. And I remember I told one of my really good friends at the time, and he was like, oh, that's cool. I answered 1 or 2 questions, and that was it. It really wasn't a big deal, and that was something I struggled with, and I spent so much time worrying about, and at the end of the day, not that no one really cared, but no one really cared that much.
Anybody else?
When we were trying to figure out what was going on with me, I would spend hours at a time at the doctor's office, and I wouldn't be able to complete all of my homework, no matter how hard I tried. So some of my teachers would give me detention, even though I would explain to them, and my parents would sign a note. And that was frustrating, and I found it ridiculous. Really, really ridiculous.
Anybody else? Willow?
Okay, so I was diagnosed with Tourette at the age of 6. I had a lot of troublesome years, but I think my 6th grade year was very frustrating and upsetting. I spent most of my days out in the hallway doing work. I don't know if any of you know what iReady is, but it's field testing that we have to do on computers. And I didn't pass that exam, so they thought that I couldn't stay in the classroom to watch a movie on Fun Friday. So yeah, that really frustrated me.
Anybody else have something?
That's the question.
Oh, that's the question. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Nobody knew.
Why would you put a kid in
It
the
was
hallway?
just punitive.
In my school, they put me out in the hallway so that the other kids could focus. That was my school, but I don't know what it was in your school.
But she missed a whole movie, a whole classroom movie.
Couldn't watch the follow-up movie to the book they were reading because she didn't pass the test for which the accommodations were.
Anybody else have a story that's something that was very difficult for them? Go ahead, Alex.
It's just the top button. It's the
I think the battery's in.
Yeah. Can you speak up?
Yes.
I know you can because I just heard you out in the hallway.
Oh, okay. My assistant principal heard me ticking one day, and he
And that night, Mom ended up calling the school and leaving a very, very angry voicemail message. I'm so proud of you, Mom.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, how about a good story? Something that has helped, something that people have done for you in school that has really helped you get through this. Go ahead, Willow.
Probably following my accommodations. Because when I don't get them followed, I really can't pass or do any of the projects or tests or the assignments in the classroom.
To add on to that, accommodations would really help if they actually provided them. Because they don't. Well, at least where we go to school.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, Jacob or Nikki, your representative.
Okay. Yeah, coming from someone whose school thankfully actually follows my accommodations, it really helps because I don't think I'd be able to perform at the level that I do without them. And I know it's not my story to tell, but there was another kid at my school that had an awful experience compared to my good experience. And it was really confusing, and it was awful to see him go through that because he didn't deserve that at all. But the school kept discriminating against him for no reason other than the fact that he has Tourette's.
One of the things that was really helpful for me was the in-service. It took some time to get my school to agree with it. They had a lot of worries about it, and it was really kind of an uphill battle, but I did have a student counselor that really helped me. One of the things that Mr. Clark actually provided for me was a hall pass. That was one of the best services that I had. It was a hall pass that was laminated, and it really helped with my OCD and Tourette's, because if there was a time where I needed to leave the classroom, I could turn in that hall pass and go walking up and down the stairs a few times to get some energy out. Or with my OCD, if there's something I was obsessing about, I always had that I could fall back on. Like my OCD, I was worried about being able to get to the bathroom or to be able to reach a bathroom. And so whenever I passed the bathroom on my way to class, I'd go in and I'd always be late. But when I had that hall pass, I knew it was something I could fall back on in case like my obsession got to be too much.
Something that really helped me was my tutor in 8th grade. She really helped me because the tutoring service the school provided online was not at all helpful, and until I got Miss Shellen, we were worried I was going to fail 8th grade and be held back. But with her help, I was able to pass 8th grade and get into a different school where I've been excelling. So that's been helpful for me. And the one thing my school has done right.
Was that tutor something that your family provided for you personally?
No, the school did that after we finally made a point to them that tutoring service.
Anybody else want to share? Well, why don't we let you guys up here ask the questions of the kids? Anything that comes to your mind that you want to ask? Yes?
Vicki, I'm wondering why you think you had better accommodation in school. Was it because of outside advocacy for you, parent advocacy for you, or self-advocacy from you to your school? Is there a reason why there was a difference?
I think there was, I'm definitely more of a self-advocate, and I think that's part of it. There was definitely a lot of factors that went into that, but I think advocating for yourself really helps, and if you don't, then they don't know what to do for you, so they can't do anything for you at all. Yeah, also I think it might have been because I've always been a good student, and not everybody with Tourette's has that chance to excel.
And this boy, I know him also is quite bright, but one of his big things is ADHD and really, really, really difficult. And I think that's, I mean, Mickey doesn't have a hyperactive bone in her body. And this kid just can't sit still for 2 seconds. And so it really made it very, very difficult. And they looked at him completely different. You're absolutely right. That's exactly what it was. Other questions? Yes. Yeah.
I have a student right now who was just recently diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. He asked if he could work in the hallway. So I was just wondering if any of you have ever asked if you could work in the hallway, like what the reasoning behind it was.
If the student themselves asked to work in the hallway?
Is it because like you feel that like people are focusing on your tics too much, or it's just too difficult in class, or you know there's something going on that you're too focused on that you need somewhere else?
I don't. Also, I don't ask to work in the hallway, but one of my accommodations is going to a separate location for testing, and that's just so my tics don't bother anybody else. Plus, it makes it a little bit easier when there's not nearly as many outside noises or distractions in the same location.
I think the problem with the hallway is that anybody who goes by, you know, usually if the kid is sent to the hallway, it's for behavior reasons, and that's what they think, and the kid's out there making noises or doing whatever, and I think that, you know, it just gives them the totally wrong message. Is that too?
And a
Silly
teacher
golf.
passing in the hallway would make a snarky remark.
That's right. It's not a remark. It's true. It's definitely true. Yeah. I worked with a girl whose accommodation was to have a separate testing location, and for about 6 months we never knew the teacher was making her take her test sitting on the floor in the hallway. That was a separate testing location.
Yeah, that's what happened in 4th grade.
Really?
The same thing, we know we knew, but of course I wasn't here, but then as soon as they found out, they took it to school immediately, but on the whole 4th grade year, even after they talked to them, I still didn't have a separate testing location. They still put me outside of the hall to remember, because it's supposed to be quiet out there.
Yeah.
It's louder out there than it is in the room.
Exactly. Exactly. Willow?
Okay, so for tests for me, I have an accommodation to go to a separate location. So I have that accommodation, and the teachers know that, but like, they'll have all the accommodations all set in place, and then either that teacher is giving tests to another student, or that person's not there that day. And then I waste like 15 minutes instead for taking my test because they don't have a location for me to go.
My alternate location at school was this tiny room with no ventilation, 3 pieces of architectural walls which supposedly made it soundproof, and it was this little room in the music wing. And because of it, I can get claustrophobic now, and I'll say, this room reminds me of the music room, and I'll have to leave it immediately. I can't handle anything like that. And it was just like this tiny room with a little desk, a bunch of music stands, some chairs, a piano, and some cases. That was it.
I wouldn't do my test, I'd put it in there.
It was attitude and a bunch of keys were missing.
I wouldn't be surprised if a rabbit would crawl.
And the teachers wouldn't sit down my work like they were supposed to, so my alternate location just made things worse while I was there. So
They have a difficult time with the alternate testing because they're used to doing it for kids for attention problems, but with an alternate location because you don't want to have disruptive tics, they don't have anywhere to send you. I find that in a lot of schools.
they designated that as my spot because they weren't using it for anything.
Yeah.
And it would get hot and clammy, and I would get claustrophobic, which just made my tics worse.
Oh, yeah.
And I would end up lying on the floor trying to calm down. The person who was with me wasn't a special aid, they were a library person. And they didn't send me work, so I would be using my phone to try and relax, and I'd get in trouble. So either send me work or let me use my phone. Give me one or the other. Don't yell at me for, oh, I remember nothing.
Okay, Skylar.
I actually remember this one time I went on like a field trip or something, and the only time I ever really get annoyed is when someone spells my name wrong. And this one time with the lunch aides who had gave me my name, I told her, hey, you spelled my name wrong. She said, so what? Deal with it. And I was like, and I just was so tempted to just
throw a rock at her.
Obsessive sense of justice. Point well taken. Skylar, this is, I won't tell the school district, you get to Majoma, but was told this year that as an 8th grader, he's supposed to take Spanish. It's mandatory. He was told that if he was on an IEP, they couldn't take a language. But they didn't realize his mom was on the school board. He's now taking Spanish. Yes.
I know in your presentation, something that you pointed out was how to get creative. And I'm taking education classes now, so I'm researching here as a teaching candidate. And we talk a lot about differentiated instruction and how we can change our lesson plans to be able to accommodate for different needs that students have. So we need to be able to excel and really grasp the concept. And I was wondering if any of you ever had a teacher who got creative and what were the strategies that they use that really helped and really stuck in your mind.
Now, strategies if someone used it where it was a little different in the classroom, would help. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so our school just changed into flexible seating. So there was like carpets on the floor, like pillows, and I use that often because I don't like sitting in a chair for 7 hours each day. Just like, I mean, it doesn't bother me to watch a teacher give lessons and stuff, but when I'm just sitting there and like, I can't focus when I'm having a really bad day. So like, just like Jay said, giving a pass to walk in the hallway, kind of calm down, give relief to yourself, that really helps.
Just kind of get out of the mainstream for a while. Jake.
Whether it was they were doing it on purpose, but a lot of the times classrooms that I would excel in was classrooms that involved a lot of movement. For example, I had a couple of teachers that kind of like review the material at the end of class or to review the homework at the beginning of class would have us get up and then write on the board. And so like divided up the class into a few different people and then we have to stand up, write on the board, brainstorm, and then we go back to our seats and go over it. And so there's a lot of small things like that that people can do to just kind of like get the class up and moving around. Because even if for a student without Tourette syndrome, it's sometimes hard to sit through a whole 40-minute lecture. But teachers that kind of involve like movement, stand up, moving around, or small discussions between classmates. So like a teacher would pose a question and then we then discuss it with a partner or someone sitting near us. And that kind of breaks up the lecture and allows for movement and your focus to shift, which makes it easier to follow, remember, and pay attention.
Yes.
This year, last year with my tutor, to learn Spanish better, like with our food unit, she brought in all these foods and we had a little meal and we spoke in Spanish. So that was fun, but in 2nd grade when I didn't have a diagnosis of Tourette, my teacher would have us running around, she would have us playing games and stuff. She would let us take our spelling tests in shaving cream foam.
Oh, mama.
We would chew gum and like eat candy during writing because moving your jaw helps you work. I filled multiple notebooks that year for writing alone with like stories with my own twists on them. It was really fun. And we played with Play-Doh so that our hands were moving and so were our minds. She would create fun songs for math. We did a birds unit where we got to create posters and see birds. There was a unit where we counted geese out on the field. There was a whole bunch of other stuff. Like that's part of it.
Just creative
She was
stuff.
great. She was like one of my favorite teachers.
You remember that all this time.
She retired.
Yes.
I have a question. I would love to hear from you all. It's clear that you are all very cool people. Listening to you speak and having you come up here and be so brave, but also like generous with your personal stories, it's amazing. But I wonder, like being in middle school and college is hard. In high school, sometimes it's hard to even walk in front of a room of people because even like your eyebrow feels awkward, everything feels awkward. So Tourette can sometimes be a little bit awkward, and I wonder what it is that you all have What is it? What do you do that makes you so cool?
What?
Yeah, what is it that you do that makes you a cool person? Like, what is something? I mean, there's a lot of things, but
Like something about ourselves.
yeah.
Like, I feel like it's important to keep kind of like a sense of humor about it. There's a lot of things that happen because of Tourette's, and that's kind of funny. It's important to be able to laugh at yourself and your shortcomings, I guess. Like, I remember one trip my family took, I believe it was to Watkins Glen. We were going through this path that was just kind of carved into the rocks, and we was following the stream around waterfalls. It was this really beautiful spot. And so as we're walking through this path and up and down and around these waterfalls and brooks and streams, at the time I had a tic that started blocking the scenes. And so as we're walking, it was a weekend, so it was very busy. So there's all sorts of people walking in other directions back as we're heading there. And the same thing on the way back, and I kept having this tic that sounded like a sneeze. And every time I had it, there would be someone walking the other way, and people would start saying, "Oh, bless you." And at first I kind of ignored it, because I was like, "Oh, I'm not sneezing, like I can't, like, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? Oh, no, it's not sneeze." And so just like after the fourth or third time that it happened, I was just like, "Oh, thank you." And my family would start laughing. And it got to the point where like we start laughing even when someone like wouldn't say bless you. Because we're like, how rude is that? I just sneezed, someone heard it, and wouldn't say anything. For all they know, I actually sneezed.
That's good.
It changed from like funny to like kind of, why are they, why are they just saying bless you?
Anybody else got a funny story or any other questions from the group? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Are you sure? I'm sorry. Yes.
When it was time for you to tell your friends and your teachers and everything, do you have any tips or ideas on how to go about that makes you feel comfortable? I know my son feels like he's completely, I know he is too.
One day I decided that I wanted to start my class, so I told my school psychologist, and she's like, "Okay, we'll call your parents and ask." I basically railroaded her into it 15 minutes before Spanish class started, so that I could do what I wanted that day. And they'll tell you that they weren't so excited about it, because they wanted to prepare, they wanted to get a youth ambassador in there, but since the school wouldn't let a youth ambassador in, I had to advocate for myself at that point, and I wasn't trained yet.
You just said, "I'm ready, I'm going to tell everybody."
And I jumped the gun. I told my Spanish class the same day. I told all of the rest of the classes I had that day. And then I just kept telling classes because people had started asking me, "What are you doing? Why are you making that noise?" The teachers had known at that point, and I just decided it's time to tell the students because questions were starting to come up. People were starting to figure things out on my bus, and it was just time. So I took the gun and railroaded them into it and did what I wanted.
Nikki had her hand up, I think. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just say it, honestly. No one's a mind reader, and you can't fix it unless you know what the problem is. So better to just get it out of the open before anybody can make their own assumptions about it, because if they make their own incorrect assumptions, they'll try to fix the ways that cannot be fixed.
What do people do where they were accepting and
As soon as you inform them about what it is and let them know, like, hey, it's not swearing, hey, it's neurological condition. As soon as you let people know information, they become more accepting of urging themselves with anything.
I want to say they honestly don't really care. And more than half the people that like you start to explain it and they're like, "Oh wow, that's great," and then they move on. It's they don't care.
Honestly, in my school, when they found out what was going on, some of them did research, some of them didn't care, and some of them were like, "Well, what's it going to do to you?" And I said, "Nothing. I'm just going to live with it and take what comes." And the teachers were the ones who caused the issues. The students were the ones who sort of somewhat supported.
Jake?
For me, after I was diagnosed, I was diagnosed pretty late. I was diagnosed when I was around 15 years old. first diagnosed, I didn't really want anyone to know. So I was being kind of like a label, something that people saw me as. And I was really worried about people finding out. So a lot of the time, I just wouldn't tell anyone. I was surprised that a couple of my teachers knew. But at that point, I didn't want anyone to know. But what I recommend is, if it wasn't someone who said, I would probably start small. He's really worried about. Probably talk to some of his closer friends about it, because that's what really helped me. I wound up telling some of my closer friends, and once I found out that they really didn't care as much as I thought they would, I thought it'd be like a topic of conversation the whole week, and get all sorts of weird questions. But at the end of the day, what happened is they were very understanding of it. They did ask me some weird questions, and they did have some of those biases, only knowing things that they've seen in movies and things like that, and sort of having some misconceptions. But it really wasn't that hard to correct it. And once I got comfortable with them knowing, I was able to kind of branch out and become more and more people. And I was really surprised at like how small it was. People really didn't care as much as I thought they would. And so like for me, starting small really helped me. So I could build on that confidence from just telling a few people and seeing it really wasn't that bad. And I could just build on that and that. And then once I told more people, I already had those people around me that already understood and could almost advocate for me as well.
Anything else? Oh, I'm sorry.
I just kind of wanted to piggyback off of that question. You know, some of you were diagnosed older, some of you were diagnosed younger. You all seem to have parents who are pretty strong advocates for you. When you were younger and diagnosed, was it okay that your parents went in, they went blazing into school, and my child has Tourette syndrome? Because a few of you have talked about disclosing it to people. Is it a big deal for your parents to have done that for you, or would you really have preferred to have that choice yourself?
Probably just feels like someone running in saying that you have a crush on someone.
That's sort of interesting. Wow.
I honestly
Yeah. I think most kids want people to know, but I think.
No, it just depends on the person. I can't really say anything because I got diagnosed late too, but I think it does depend on the person and what I've seen from everybody else. No, it depends on the person. We just have to recognize your child, because some of us have anxiety over it, some of us don't care, some of us want to be advocates. So I think it's, like, I can't really say much because I was diagnosed later, but from what I've seen and who I've spoken to, it really depends on the person.
Yes.
I guess kind of piggyback, I think at the end of the day, sometimes it's still going to depend on the peers, and maybe, and you might maybe tell me how the teacher handled that information as well. The question I have, and it's something I actually requested right to after my son's IEPs, I wanted all the people with special ed teachers, music, gym, art. I wanted to make sure that they get emailed all the academic accommodations that have to be made, because I felt he's not just in his general open teachers class all the time, he goes through his other subjects as well. How do you guys feel about that? Do you feel sometimes that the unified art teachers were not as well informed as your general ed teacher, or what's your opinion on that?
Why would you even have to ask the other teachers to know different?
Yeah.
Exactly, you shouldn't have to ask.
But they often skip that.
There's probably often skip that, and that's why I was
Yeah.
very persistent. So maybe that's a recommendation, make sure. And if anybody give you a hard time, insist that you can CC it on that email that goes out, or something.
By law, they're supposed to be following
That's right.
that. So
By law.
by law, they're supposed to be following that.
I guess what happens is by law, they're supposed to follow, so it's available for all the teachers. So that's not good enough.
One of the issues, so I'm a teacher, one of the
Yes.
issues that I see is that, so the special area, we call them special area teachers, are not trained to read 504s or IEPs. So if you've never seen an IEP or a 504 and you're looking at it, I'm a trained music teacher. That means I spent 4 years studying music, and I probably had 2 classes on teaching when I'm teaching kids. what happens.
Right.
So districts need to be more accountable for getting their staff a little bit more up to speed on what 504s and IEPs mean, and that they are a legal binding document, and they're all held accountable.
So I'm a school psychologist by trade, and at the beginning of every school year, every single teacher that has contacted that student has to sign a form saying,
Right.
I've read the IEP and I understand what it means. But at that point, they don't understand what that means. They need to be going to the psychologist, special ed teacher who's managing that IEP and saying, I don't understand this and I need help. And if they're not doing that, then they're signing that paper and putting their motion.
Yeah.
I have one other suggestion. I think that bus drivers and aides
Absolutely.
notifies of your child and their issues. Because
Yes.
I can't tell you what issues we ran into with the bus driver,
Yeah.
yelling at Alexandra because she
Every day.
I was running a really bad screech, and she had very loud vocal texting every other second.
It's going to be with that out because our school parent advisory group and a lot of committee, I think that would be a recommendation that we parents make sure that's on the IEP.
Yeah.
It means that, yes.
You can put a mandatory in-service on an IEP as part of the teacher prep, yeah. I put it on every one that I work on, 504, that every year, and give them a time frame, like in the first couple of weeks, there'll be a mandatory in-service for all the staff working with that child. And it really, you know, once it's on there, they have to do it, and it really makes a big difference. Yes?
I can kind of comment on this from two perspectives. I'm a special ed teacher, but I also have an 8-year-old who's born with Down syndrome, so I kind of see both sides of this. So I know, like, as a special ed teacher, something that I implemented in my school is that after the teachers read them, we come up with, like, an IEP at a glance or a 504 at a glance. We do write about, like, what are the good working strategies for the kids, and it's written very simply, like, right to the point, and we do distribute that to all the teachers once they've read the IEP, and it kind of clarifies any of those
Right.
misconceptions that they might have. On the other side, my sister goes to a different school district, and it's not something that her teachers do, and we ran into a lot of problems with the music teacher, with the bus drivers, all those kinds of things, so I've helped my mom to come up with, like, good working strategies, just like a half sheet of paper, and my mom will give that directly to the teachers, just because at the end of the day, it's about what's going to work best for the kid, and, you know, how are we going to get everyone to make sure that they have a successful day.
Exactly.
Something.
Anything else? Yes?
I had one, but I'm sorry we have gotten off the topic of this question about your social life. So I know that a part of my son's IEPs is a psychologist and then a friend or a couple of friends to work on pragmatic speech and social skills and build social groups. And I have a personal opinion about that, and he won't share with me his personal opinion about that. And I'm wondering if that was anything that you guys had, that you did in school, if
think having that go-to person is so important for every kid, just somebody you know you can trust and open up with, and, yes.
Can I put in a plug for the buddy program here?
Yeah.
This is a perfect opportunity. Our chapter has a buddy program where they match up kids with Tourette with other kids with Tourette, and they relate very well to each other. If you have the right combination of personalities working together, you develop really strong relationships, and you can pick up the phone and you can call and say, I'm having a really difficult time at school. What did you do when you were in 7th grade and you went through a difficult period? Can you give me any suggestions? And I think it's great to have kids who have had similar experiences. They might not be identical, but they have similar experiences. They understand where you're coming from. Because if you don't have friends who have, who've been bullied or who can't go to school because they're making so much noise that the teachers are kicking them out of class, they just can't relate to it. So if your chapter has something like a buddy program, and if they don't, I would suggest starting one. It's been very successful. I mean, it's hit or miss. I mean, if you bring personalities, it's an amazing program.
Yeah. And I think some of the things that we do with our camp and some of our other activities, it gives the kids a chance several times a year to get together, and they use social media to communicate back and forth with each other, and it really does help. I think it's just knowing they're not alone. They're not the only one out there, because sometimes you feel that way. But we've gone way over the time, and I know it's getting late, so I want to give these kids a tremendous round of applause. They do a great job, and it's been my joy watching them all grow up and be so successful. And I've done this for a long time, and it just brings tears to my eyes. But I see, what's in there, and they can do it. But somebody's got to make that path for them, and that's the biggest challenge: is getting schools to understand what needs to be done for these kids, because they can be anything they want. I mean, we've got some extremely talented kids sitting in front of us, really, very much so. And for their age, very articulate. It's just amazing. So, and I see it with Jake. He's the oldest, and knowing his struggles, it's been a long haul. It's been a long haul, but he's gotten here. Here he is. Anybody who needs a certificate of attendance, I have them down here. Just come and get one before you leave. And the tables are still, I think, set up with the literature. So anybody who wants the chapter brochures are there from all the New York State chapters. If you're in the Albany area, that's the greater New York State chapter. But if you're from another region, you can look and see there's still a bunch of stuff out there.
They might have taken it from the Albany.
Oh, okay. But every chapter in the state has a tremendous amount to offer. Schools, families, we all have really excellent programs, and we work as a consortium together. So please, use and abuse us. Right? Yes.
As soon as your PowerPoint is available,
Anybody who's here, if you registered, I have your email address. If you haven't, make sure you give it to me. I've got one that I just got, and I will be sending out the PowerPoint probably today or tomorrow, and the handouts, electronic handouts like our catalog of accommodations, information about our functional behavioral assessment, that kind of stuff. Yeah, thank you.
do you need the email there, or if we handwritten it on their attendance list?
Did you register with this program this
I
afternoon?
registered with this morning's program, and then I wrote my information on the attendance list.
Okay, that's perfect then. That's absolutely fine. Yep, because I use that list to send out the electronic handouts, and if for some reason in the next 2 or 3 days you don't get it, just shoot me an email. But I usually get them out quite quickly. It's an easy thing to do. So, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and some of you will see you tomorrow at our family day. So.